It was now as if a single immense body had, in the course of millennia, dissolved into its parts, and these parts had been arranged to occupy the whole crypt, more splendid than the ossarium of the dead monks but not unlike it, and as if the substantial form of man's very body, the masterpiece of creation, had shattered into plural and separate accidental forms, thus becoming the image of its own opposite, form no longer ideal but earthly, of dust and stinking fragments, capable of signifying only death and destruction. Now I could no longer find the banqueters or the gifts they had brought. It was as if all the guests of the symposium were now in the crypt, each mummified in its own residue, each the diaphanous synecdoche of itself. Rachel as a bone, Daniel as a tooth, Samson as a jaw, Jesus as a shred of purple garment. As if, at the end of the banquet, the feast transformed into the girl's slaughter, it had become the universal slaughter, and here I was seeing its final result, the bodies, no, the whole terrestrial and sublunar body of those ravenous and thirsting feasters, transformed into a single dead body, lacerated and tormented like Dulcino's body after his torture, transformed into a loathsome and resplendent treasure, stretched out to its full extent like the hide of a skinned and hung animal, which still contained, however, petrified, the leather sinews, the viscera, and all the organs, and even the features of the face. The skin with each of its folds, wrinkles, and scars, with its velvety planes, its forest of hairs, the dermis, the bosom, the pudenda, having become a sumptuous damask, and the breasts, the nails, the horny formations under the heel, the threads of the lashes, the watery substance of the eyes, the flesh of the lips, the thin spine of the back, the architecture of the bones, everything reduced to sandy powder, though nothing had lost its own form or respective placement, the legs emptied and limp as a boot, their flesh lying flat like a chasuble with all the scarlet embroidery of the veins, the engraved pile of the viscera, the intense and mucous ruby of the heart, the pearly file of even teeth arranged like a necklace, with the tongue as a pink and blue pendant, the fingers in a row like tapers, the seal of the navel reknotting the threads of the unrolled carpet of the belly. From every corner of the crypt, now I was grinned at, whispered to, bidden to death by this macrobody divided among glass cases and reliquaries and yet reconstructed in its vast and irrational whole. And it was the same body that at the supper had eaten and tumbled obscenely but here, instead, appeared to me fixed in the intangibility of its deaf and blind ruin. And Ubertino, seizing me by the arm, digging his nails into my flesh, whispered to me, "You see, it is the same thing. What first triumphed in its folly and took delight in its jesting now is here, punished and rewarded, liberated from the seduction of the passions, rigidified by eternity, consigned to the eternal frost that is to preserve and purify it, saved from corruption through the triumph of corruption, because nothing more can reduce to dust that which is already dust and mineral substance. Mors est caes viatoris, finis est omnis laboris." But suddenly Salvator entered the crypt, glowing like a devil, and cried, "Fool! Can't you see this is the great Lyotard? What are you afraid of, my little master? Here is the cheese and batter." And suddenly the crypt was bright with reddish flashes and it was again the kitchen, but not so much a kitchen as the inside of a great womb, mucous and viscid, and in the center an animal black as a raven and with 1,000 hands was chained to a huge grate, and it extended those limbs to snatch everybody around it, and as the peasant when thirsty squeezes a bunch of grapes, so that great beast squeezed those it had snatched so that its hands broke them all, the legs of some, the heads of others, and then it sated itself, belching a fire that seemed to stink more than sulfur. But, wondrous mystery, that scene no longer instilled fear in me, and I was surprised to see that I could watch easily that good devil, so I thought, who after all was none other than Salvator, because now I knew all about the mortal human body, its sufferings and its corruption, and I feared nothing any more. In fact, in the light of that flame, which now seemed mild and convivial, I saw again all the guests of the supper, now restored to their original forms, singing and declaring that everything was beginning again, and among them was the maiden, whole and most beautiful, who said to me, it is nothing, you will see. I shall be even more beautiful than before. Just let me go for a moment and burn on the pyre, then we shall meet again here." And she displayed to me, God have mercy on me, her vulva, into which I entered, and I found myself in a beautiful cave, which seemed the happy valley of the golden age, dewy with waters and fruits and trees that bore cheeses in batter. And all were thanking the abbot for the lovely feast, and they showed him their affection and good humor by pushing him, kicking him, tearing his clothes, laying him on the ground, striking his rod with rods, as he laughed and begged them to stop tickling him. And, riding mounts whose nostrils emitted clouds of brimstone, the friars of the poor life entered, carrying at their belts purses full of gold with which they transformed wolves into lambs and lambs into wolves and crowned him emperor with the approval of the assembly, of the people, who sang praises of God's infinite omnipotence. Ut cacinus dissolvitur, torquiator rictibus. Jesus shouted, waving his crown of thorns. Pope John came in, cursing the confusion and saying, "At this rate I don't know where it all will end." But everyone mocked him and, led by the abbot, went out with the pigs to hunt truffles in the forest. I was about to follow them when in a corner I saw William, emerging from the labyrinth and carrying in his hand the magnet, which pulled him rapidly northward. "Do not leave me, master," I shouted. "I, too, want to see what is in the Finis Africae." "You have already seen it," William answered, far away by now. And I woke up as the last words of the funeral chant were ending in the church. Lacrimosa dies illiqua resurgit ex favelae dicandus homo rois, huic ergo pars deus. Pi iesu dominadona eis requiem. A sign that my vision, rapid like all visions, if it had not lasted the space of an amen, as the saying goes, had lasted almost the length of a dies irae. After TERCE. In which William explains Adza's dream to him. Dazed, I came out through the main door and discovered a little crowd there. The Franciscans were leaving, and William had come down to say goodbye to them. I joined in the farewells, the fraternal embraces. Then I asked William when the others would be leaving with the prisoners. He told me they had already left, half an hour before, while we were in the treasure crypt, or perhaps, I thought, when I was dreaming. For a moment I was aghast, then I recovered myself. Better so. I would not have been able to bear the sight of the condemned. I meant the poor wretched cellarer and Salvador, and, of course, I also meant the girl being dragged off, far away and forever. And besides, I was still so upset by my dream that my feelings seemed numb. As the caravan of Minorites headed for the gate, to leave the abbey, William and I remained in front of the church, both melancholy, though for different reasons. Then I decided to tell my master my dream. Though the vision had been multiform and illogical, I remembered it with amazing clarity, image by image, action by action, word by word. And so I narrated it, omitting nothing, because I knew that dreams are often mysterious messages in which learned people can read distinct prophecies. William listened to me in silence, then asked me, "Do you know what you have dreamed?" "Exactly what I told you," I replied, at a loss. "Of course, I realize that. But do you know that to a great extent what you tell me has already been written? You have added people and events of these past few days to a picture already familiar to you, because you have read the story of your dream somewhere, or it was told you as a boy, in school, in the convent. It is the Coina Cipriani." I remained puzzled briefly. Then I remembered. He was right. Perhaps I had forgotten the title, but what adult monk or unruly young novice has not smiled or laughed over the various visions, in prose or rhyme, of this story, which belongs to the tradition of the Paschal season in the Ioca Monachorum? Though the work is banned or execrated by the more austere among novice masters, there is still not a convent in which the monks have not whispered it to one another, variously condensed and revised, while some piously copied it, declaring that behind a veil of mirth it concealed secret moral lessons, and others encouraged its circulation because, they said, through its jesting, the young could more easily commit to memory certain episodes of sacred history. A verse version had been written for Pope John VIII, with the inscription, "I love to jest. Accept me, dear Pope John, in my jesting. And, if you wish, you can also laugh." And it was said that Charles the Bald himself had staged it, in the guise of a comic sacred mystery, in a rhymed version to entertain his dignitaries at supper. And how many scoldings had I received from my masters when, with my companions, I recited passages from it. I remembered an old friar at Melk who used to say that a virtuous man like Cyprian could not have written such an indecent thing, such a sacrilegious parody of scripture, worthier of an infidel and a buffoon than of a holy martyr. For years I had forgotten those childish jokes. Why on this day had the Coina reappeared so vividly in my dream? I had always thought that dreams were divine messages, or at worst absurd stammerings of the sleeping memory about things that had happened during the clay. I was now realizing that one can also dream books, and therefore dream of dreams. "I should like to be Artemidorus to interpret your dream correctly," William said. "But it seems to me that even without Artemidorus's learning it is easy to understand what happened. In these past days, my poor boy, you have experienced a series of events in which every upright rule seems to have been destroyed. And this morning, in your sleeping mind, there returned the memory of a kind of comedy in which, albeit with other intentions, the world is described upside down. You inserted into that work your most recent memories, your anxieties, your fears. From the marginalia of Adelmo you went on to relive a great carnival where everything seems to proceed in the wrong direction, and yet, as in the Coina, each does what he really did in life. And finally you asked yourself, in the dream, which world is the false one, and what it means to walk head down. Your dream no longer distinguished what is down and what is up, where life is and where death. Your dream cast doubt on the teachings you have received. My dream, I said virtuously, not I but dreams are not divine messages, then, they are diabolical ravings, and they contain no truth. I don't know, Adza, William said. We already have so many truths in our possession that if the day came when someone insisted on deriving a truth even from our dreams, then the day of the Antichrist would truly be at hand. And yet, the more I think of your dream, the more revealing it seems to me. Perhaps not to you, but to me. Forgive me if I use your dream in order to work out my hypotheses. I know, it is a base action, it should not be done. But I believe that your sleeping soul understood more things than I have in 6 days, and awake. Truly? Truly. Or perhaps not. I find your dream revealing because it coincides with one of my hypotheses. But you have given me great help. Thank you. But what was there in my dream that interests you so much? It made no sense, like all dreams. It had another sense like all dreams and visions. It must be read as an allegory or an analogy. Like scripture? A dream is a scripture, and many scriptures are nothing but dreams. Sext, in which the succession of librarians is reconstructed, and there is further information about the mysterious book. William decided to go back up to the scriptorium, from which he had just come. He asked Benno's leave to consult the catalogue, and he leafed through it rapidly. "It must be around here," he said. "I saw it just an hour ago." He stopped at one page. Here, he said, read this title. As a single entry there was a group of 4 titles, indicating that one volume contains several texts. I read, I.A.R. De Dictis Quiesdam Stulta. 2. Syr. Libellus Alchemicus a Egypt. 3. Expositio Magistri Alcofrabe de Coina Beati Cypriani Cartaginensis Episcopi. IV. Liber Acephalus de Stupris Virginum et Meretricum Amoribus. What is it? I asked. It is our book, William whispered to me. This is why your dream reminded me of something. Now I am sure this is it. And in fact, he glanced quickly at the pages immediately preceding and following. In fact, here are the books I was thinking about, all together. But this isn't what I wanted to check. See here. Do you have your tablet? Good. We must make a calculation, and try to remember clearly what Alenardo told us the other day as well as what we heard this morning from Nicholas. Now, Nicholas told us he arrived here about 30 years ago, and ABO had already been named abbot. The abbot before him was Paul of Rimini. Is that right? Let's say this succession took place around 1290, more or less, it doesn't matter. Nicholas also told us that, when he arrived, Robert of Bobbio was already librarian. Correct? Then Robert died, and the post was given to Malachi, let's say at the beginning of this century. Write this down. There is a period, however, before Nicholas came, when Paul of Rimini was librarian. How long was he in that post? We weren't told. We could examine the abbey ledgers, but I imagine the abbot has them, and for the moment I would prefer not to ask him for them. Let's suppose Paul was appointed librarian 60 years ago. Write that. Why does Alenardo complain of the fact that, about 50 years ago, he should have been given the post of librarian and instead it went to another? Was he referring to Paul of Rimini? Or to Robert of Bobbio? I said, so it would seem. But now look at this catalogue. As you know, the titles are recorded in the order of acquisition. And who writes them in this ledger? The librarian. Therefore, by the changes of handwriting in these pages we can establish the succession of librarians. Now we will look at the catalogue from the end. The last handwriting is Malachi's, you see. And it fills only a few pages. The abbey has not acquired many books in these last 30 years. Then, as we work backward, a series of pages begins in a shaky hand. I clearly read the presence of Robert of Bobbio, who was ill. Robert probably did not occupy the position long. And then what do we find? Pages and pages in another hand, straight and confident, a whole series of acquisitions, including the group of books I was examining a moment ago, truly impressive. Paul of Rimini must have worked hard. Too hard, if you recall that Nicholas told us he became abbot while still a young man. But let's assume that in a few years this voracious reader enriched the abbey with so many books. Weren't we told he was called Abbas Agraphicus because of that strange defect, or illness, which made him unable to write? Then who wrote these pages? His assistant librarian, I would say. But if by chance this assistant librarian were then named librarian, he would then have continued writing, and we would have figured out why there are so many pages here in the same hand. So, then, between Paul and Robert we would have another librarian, chosen about 50 years ago, who was the mysterious rival of Alenardo, who was hoping, as an older man, to succeed Paul. Then this man died, and somehow, contrary to Alenardo's expectations and the expectations of others, Robert was named in his place. But why are you so sure this is the right scansion? Even granting that this handwriting is the nameless librarian's, why couldn't Paul also have written the titles of the still earlier pages? Because among the acquisitions they recorded all bulls and decretals, and these are precisely dated. I mean, if you find here, as you do, the Firma Cautela of Boniface VII, dated 1296, you know that text did not arrive before that year, and you can assume it didn't arrive much later. I have these milestones, so to speak, placed along the years, so if I grant that Paul of Rimini became librarian in 1265 and abbot in 1275, and I find that his hand, or the hand of someone else who is not Robert of Bobbio, lasts from 1265 to 1285, then I discover a discrepancy of 10 years. My master was truly very sharp. But what conclusions do you draw from this discrepancy? I asked. None, he answered. Only some premises. Then he got up and went to talk with Benno, who was staunchly at his post, but with a very unsure air. He was still behind his old desk and had not dared take over Malachi's by the catalogue. William addressed him with some coolness. We had not forgotten the unpleasant scene of the previous evening. Even in your new and powerful position, brother librarian, I trust you will answer a question. That morning when Adelmo and the others were talking here about witty riddles, and Berengar made the first reference to the Finis Africae, did anybody mention the Coina Cypriani? Yes, Benno said, didn't I tell you? Before they talked about the riddles of Symphocius, Venantius himself mentioned the Coina, and Malachi became furious, saying it was an ignoble work and reminding us that the abbot had forbidden anyone to read it. The abbot? William said. Very interesting. Thank you, Benno. Wait, Benno said, I want to talk with you. He motioned us to follow him out of the scriptorium, onto the stairs going down to the kitchen, so the others could not hear him. His lips were trembling. I'm frightened, William, he said. They've killed Malachi. Now I am the one who knows too many things. Besides, the group of Italians hate me. They do not want another foreign librarian. I believe the others were murdered for this very reason. I've never told you about Alenardo's hatred for Malachi, his bitterness. Who was it who took the post from him, years ago? That I don't know. He always talks about it vaguely, and anyway it's ancient history. They must all be dead now. But the group of Italians around Alenardo spoke often of Malachi as a straw man, put here by someone else, with the complicity of the abbot. Not realizing it, I have become involved in the conflict of the two hostile factions. I became aware of it only this morning. Italy is a land of conspiracies. They poison popes here, so just imagine a poor boy like me. Yesterday I hadn't understood. I believed that book was responsible for everything, but now I'm no longer sure. That was the pretext. You've seen that the book was found, but Malachi died all the same. I would like to run away. What do you advise me to do? Stay calm. Now you ask advice, do you? Yesterday evening you seemed ruler of the world. Silly youth, if you had helped me yesterday we would have prevented this last crime. You are the one who gave Malachi the book that brought him to his death. But tell me one thing at least. Did you have that book in your hands? Did you touch it, read it? Then why are you not dead? I don't know. I swear I didn't touch it, or rather, I touched it when I took it in the laboratory but without opening it. I hid it inside my habit, then went and put it under the pallet in my cell. I knew. Malachi was watching me, so I came back at once to the scriptorium. And afterward, when Malachi offered to make me his assistant, I gave him the book. That's the whole story. Don't tell me you didn't even open it. Yes, I did open it before hiding it, to make sure it really was the one you were also looking for. It began with an Arabic manuscript, then I believe one in Syriac, then there was a Latin text, and finally one in Greek. I remembered the abbreviations we had seen in the catalog. The first two titles were listed as AR and SYR, it was the book. But William persisted. You touched it and you are not dead. So touching it does not kill. And what can you tell me about the Greek text? Did you look at it? Very briefly. Just long enough to realize it had no title. It began as if a part were missing. Liber acephalus, William murmured. I tried to read the first page, but the truth is that my Greek is very poor. And then my curiosity was aroused by another detail, connected with those same pages in Greek. I did not leaf through all of them, because I was unable to. The pages were, how can I explain, damp, stuck together. It was hard to separate one from the other. Because the parchment was odd, softer than other parchments, and the first page was rotten and almost crumbling. It was, well, strange. Strange. The very word Severinus used, William said. The parchment did not seem like parchment. It seemed like cloth, but very fine. Benno went on. Charta lintea, or linen paper, William said. Had you never seen it? I had heard of it, but I don't believe I ever saw it before. It is said to be very costly and delicate. That's why it is rarely used. The Arabs make it, don't they? They were the first. But it is also made here in Italy, at Fabriano. And also. Why, of course, naturally. William's eyes shone. What a beautiful and interesting revelation. Good for you, Benno. I thank you. Yes, I imagine that here in the library Charta lintea must be rare, because no very recent manuscripts have arrived. And besides, many are afraid linen paper will not survive through the centuries like parchment, and perhaps that is true. Let us imagine, if they wanted something here that was not more perennial than bronze. Charta lintea, then? Very well. Goodbye. And don't worry. You're in no danger. We went away from the scriptorium, leaving Benno calmer, if not totally reassured. The abbot was in the refectory. William went to him and asked to speak with him. ABO, unable to temporize, agreed to meet us in a short while at his house. Nuns. In which the abbot refuses to listen to William, discourses on the language of gems, and expresses a wish that there be no further investigation of the recent unhappy events. The abbot's apartments were over the chapter hall, and from the window of the large and sumptuous main room, where he received us, you could see, on that clear and windy day, beyond the roof of the abbatial church, the massive edificium. The abbot, standing at the window, was in fact contemplating it, and he pointed it out to us with a solemn gesture. An admirable fortress, he said, whose proportions sum up the golden rule that governed the construction of the ark. Divided into 3 stories, because 3 is the number of the Trinity. 3 were the angels who visited Abraham, the days Jonah spent in the belly of the great fish, and the days Jesus and Lazarus passed in the sepulchre. 3 times Christ asked the Father to let the bitter chalice pass from him, and 3 times he hid himself to pray with the apostles. 3 times Peter denied him, and 3 times Christ appeared to his disciples after the resurrection. The theological virtues are 3, and 3 are the holy languages, the parts of the soul, the classes of intellectual creatures, angels, men, and devils. There are 3 kinds of sound, vox, flatus, pulsus, and 3 epochs of human history, before, during, and after the law. A wondrous harmony of mystical relations, William agreed. But the square shape also, the abbot continued, is rich in spiritual lessons. The cardinal points are 4, and the seasons, the elements, and heat, cold, wet, and dry, birth, growth, maturity, and old age, the species of animals, celestial, terrestrial, aerial, and aquatic, the colors forming the rainbow, and the number of years required to make a leap year. Oh, to be sure, William said, and 3 plus 4 is 7, a superlatively mystical number. Whereas 3 multiplied by 4 makes 12, like the apostles, and 12 by 12 makes 144, which is the number of the elect. And to this last display of mystical knowledge of the ideal world of numbers, the abbot had nothing further to add. Thus William could come to the point. We must talk about the latest events, on which I have reflected at length, he said. The abbot turned his back to the window and looked straight at William with a stern face. At too great length, perhaps. I must confess, brother William, that I expected more of you. Almost 6 days have passed since you arrived here. 4 monks have died besides Adelmo, 2 have been arrested by the Inquisition. It was justice, to be sure, but we could have avoided this shame if the Inquisitor had not been obliged to concern himself with the previous crimes. And finally the meeting over which I presided has, precisely because of all these wicked deeds, had a pitiful outcome. William remained silent, embarrassed. Without question, the abbot was right. That is true, he admitted. I have not lived up to your expectations, but I will explain why, your sublimity. These crimes do not stem from a brawl or from some vendetta among the monks, but from deeds that, in their turn, originate in the remote history of the abbey. The abbot looked at him uneasily. What do you mean? I myself realize that the key is not that miserable affair of the cellarer, which has intersected another story. But the other, that other which I may know but cannot discuss. I hoped it was clear, and that you would speak to me about it. Your sublimity is thinking of some deed he learned about in confession. The abbot looked away, and William continued. If your magnificence wants to know whether I know, without having learned it from your magnificence, that there were illicit relations between Berengar and Adelmo, and between Berengar and Malachi, well, yes, everyone in the abbey knows this. The abbot blushed violently. I do not believe it useful to speak of such things in the presence of this novice. And I do not believe, now that the meeting is over, that you need him any longer as scribe. Go, boy, he said to me imperiously. Humiliated, I went. But in my curiosity I crouched outside the door of the hall, which I left ajar, so that I could follow the dialogue. William resumed speaking. So, then, these illicit relations, if they did take place, had scant influence on the painful events. The key is elsewhere, as I thought you imagined. Everything turns on the theft and possession of a book, which was concealed in the Finis Africae, and which is now there again thanks to Malachi's intervention, though, as you have seen, the sequence of crimes was not thereby arrested. A long silence followed. Then the abbot resumed speaking, in a broken, hesitant voice, like someone taken aback by unexpected revelations. This is impossible, how do you know about the Finis Africae? Have you violated my ban and entered the library? William ought to have told the truth, but the abbot's rage would have known no bounds. Yet, obviously my master did not want to lie. He chose to answer the question with another question. Did your magnificence not say to me, at our first meeting, that a man like me, who had described Brunellus so well without ever having seen him, would have no difficulty picturing places to which he did not have access? So that is it, Abo said. But why do you think what you think? How I arrived at my conclusion is too long a story. But a series of crimes was committed to prevent many from discovering something that it was considered undesirable for them to discover. Now all those who knew something of the library's secrets, whether rightly or through trickery, are dead. Only one person remains. Yourself. Do you wish to insinuate? You wish to insinuate, the abbot said. Do not misunderstand me, said William, who probably had indeed wished to insinuate. I say there is someone who knows and wants no one else to know. As the last to know, you could be the next victim. Unless you tell me what you know about that forbidden book, and, especially, who in the abbey might know what you know, and perhaps more, about the library. It is cold in here, the abbot said. Let us go out. I moved rapidly away from the door and waited for them at the head of the stairs. The abbot saw me and smiled at me. How many upsetting things this young monk must have heard in the past few days. Come, boy, do not allow yourself to be too distressed. It seems to me that more plots have been imagined than really exist. He raised one hand and allowed the daylight to illuminate a splendid ring he wore on his 4th finger, the emblem of his power. The ring sparkled with all the brilliance of its stones. You recognize it, do you not? He said to me. The symbol of my authority, but also of my burden. It is not an ornament. It is a splendid syllogy of the divine word whose guardian I am. With his fingers he touched the stone, or rather, the arrangement of variegated stones composing that admirable masterpiece of human art and nature. This is amethyst, he said, which is the mirror of humility and reminds us of the ingenuousness and sweetness of St. Matthew. This is chalcedony, mark of charity, symbol of the piety of Joseph and St. James the Greater. This is jasper, which bespeaks faith and is associated with St. Peter, and sardonyx, sign of martyrdom, which recalls St. Bartholomew. This is sapphire, hope and contemplation, the stone of St. Andrew and St. Paul, and beryl, sound doctrine, learning, and longanimity, the virtues of St. Thomas. How splendid the language of gems is, he went on, lost in his mystical vision, which the lapidaries of tradition have translated from the reasoning of Aaron and the description of the heavenly Jerusalem in the book of the Apostle. For that matter, the walls of Zion were decked with the same jewels that decorated the pectoral of Moses' brother, except for carbuncle, agate, and onyx, which, mentioned in Exodus, are replaced in the Apocalypse by chalcedony, sardonyx, chrysoprase, and jacinth. He moved the ring and dazzled my eyes with its sparkling, as if he wanted to stun me. Marvelous language, is it not? For other fathers stones signify still other things. For Pope Innocent III the ruby announced calm and patience, the garnet, charity. For Saint Bruno aquamarine concentrates theological learning in the virtue of its purest rays. Turquoise signifies joy. Sardonyx suggests the seraphim. Topaz, the cherubim. Jasper, thrones. Chrysolite, dominions. Sapphire, the virtues. Onyx, the powers. Beryl, principalities. Ruby, archangels, and emerald, angels. The language of gems is multiform. Each expresses several truths, according to the sense of the selected interpretation, according to the context in which they appear. And who decides what is the level of interpretation and what is the proper context? You know, my boy, for they have taught you. It is authority, the most reliable commentator of all and the most invested with prestige, and therefore with sanctity. Otherwise, how to interpret the multiple signs that the world sets before our sinners' eyes, how to avoid the misunderstandings into which the devil lures us? Mind you, it is extraordinary how the devil hates the language of gems, as Saint Hildegard testifies. The foul beast sees in it a message illuminated by different meanings or levels of knowledge, and he would like to destroy it because he, the enemy, senses in the splendor of stones the echo of the marvels in his possession before his fall, and he understands that this radiance is produced by fire, which is his torment. He held out the ring for me to kiss, and I knelt. He stroked my head. And so, boy, you must forget the things, no doubt erroneous, that you have heard these days. You have entered the noblest, the greatest order of all. Of this order I am an abbot, and you are under my jurisdiction. Hear my command. Forget, and may your lips be sealed forever. Swear. Moved, subjugated, I would certainly have sworn. And you, my good reader, would not be able now to read this faithful chronicle of mine. But at this point William intervened, not perhaps to prevent me from swearing, but in an instinctive reaction, out of irritation, to interrupt the abbot, to break that spell he had surely cast. What does the boy have to do with it? I asked you a question, I warned you of a danger, I asked you to tell me a name. Do you now wish me, to kiss the ring and swear to forget what I have learned or what I suspect? Ah, you, the abbot said sadly, I do not expect a mendicant friar to understand the beauty of our traditions, or respect the reticence, the secrets, the mysteries of charity. Yes, charity, and the sense of honor, and the vow of silence on which our greatness is based. You have spoken to me of a strange story, an incredible story. About a banned book that has caused a chain of murders, about someone who knows what only I should know. Tales, meaningless accusations. Speak of it, if you wish, no one will believe you. And even if some element of your fanciful reconstruction were true, well, now everything is once more under my control, my jurisdiction. I will look into this, I have the means, I have the authority. At the very beginning I made a mistake, asking an outsider, however wise, however worthy of trust, to investigate things that are my responsibility alone. But you understood, as you have told me. I believed at the outset that it involved a violation of the vow of chastity, and, imprudent as I was, I wanted someone else to tell me what I had heard in confession. Well, now you have told me. I am very grateful to you for what you have done or have tried to do. The meeting of the legations has taken place, your mission here is over. I imagine you are anxiously awaited at the imperial court. One does not deprive oneself at length of a man like you. I give you permission to leave the abbey. Today it is perhaps late. I do not want you to travel after sunset, for the roads are not safe. You will leave tomorrow morning, early. Oh, do not thank me. It has been a joy to have you here, a brother among brothers, honoring you with our hospitality. You may withdraw now with your novice to prepare your baggage. I will say goodbye to you again tomorrow at dawn. I thank you, with all my heart. Naturally, it is not necessary for you to continue your investigations. Do not disturb the monks further. You may go. It was more than a dismissal, it was an expulsion. William said goodbye and we went down the stairs. What does this mean? I asked. I no longer understood anything. Try to formulate a hypothesis. You must have learned how it is done. Actually, I have learned I must formulate at least two, one in opposition to the other, and both incredible. Very well, then, I gulped. Formulating hypotheses made me nervous. First hypothesis. The abbot knew everything already and imagined you would discover nothing. Second hypothesis. The abbot never suspected anything, about what I don't know, because I don't know what's in your mind. But, anyhow, he went on thinking it was all because of a quarrel between sodomite monks. Now, however, you have opened his eyes, he has suddenly understood something terrible, has thought of a name, has a precise idea about who is responsible for the crimes. But at this point he wants to resolve the matter by himself and wants to be rid of you, in order to save the honor of the abbey. Good work. You are beginning to reason well. But you see already that in both cases our abbot is concerned for the good name of his monastery. Murderer or next victim as he may be, he does not want defamatory news about this holy community to travel beyond these mountains. Kill his monks, but do not touch the honor of his abbey. Ah, by William was now becoming infuriated. That bastard of a feudal lord, that peacock who gained fame for having been the Aquinas' gravedigger, that inflated wineskin who exists only because he wears a ring as big as the bottom of a glass. Proud, proud, all of you Cluniacs, worse than princes, more baronial than barons. Master, I ventured, hurt, in a reproachful tone. You be quiet, you are made of the same stuff. Your band are not simple men, or sons of the simple. If a peasant comes along you may receive him, but as I saw yesterday, you do not hesitate to hand him over to the secular arm. But not one of your own, no, he must be shielded. ABO is capable of identifying the wretch, stabbing him in the treasure crypt, and passing out his kidneys among the reliquaries, provided the honor of the abbey is saved. Have a Franciscan, a plebeian Minorite, discover the rat's nest of this holy house? Ah, no, this is something ABO cannot allow at any price. Thank you, Brother William, the Emperor needs you, you see what a beautiful ring I have, goodbye. But now the challenge is not just a matter between me and ABO, it is between me and the whole business. I am not leaving these walls until I have found out. He wants me to leave tomorrow morning, does he? Very well, it's his house, but by tomorrow morning I must know. I must. You must? Who obliges you now? No one ever obliges us to know, Adza. We must, that is all, even if we comprehend imperfectly. I was still confused and humiliated by William's words against my order and its abbots. And I tried to justify ABO in part, formulating a third hypothesis, exercising a skill at which, it seemed to me, I was becoming very dexterous. You have not considered a third possibility, Master, I said. We had noticed these past days, and this morning it seemed quite clear to us after Nicholas's confidences and the rumors we heard in church, that there is a group of Italian monks reluctant to tolerate the succession of foreign librarians. They accuse the abbot of not respecting tradition, and, as I understand it, they hide behind old Alenardo, thrusting him forward like a standard, to ask for a different government of the abbey. So perhaps the abbot fears our revelations could give his enemies a weapon, and he wants to settle the question with great prudence. That is possible, but he is still an inflated wineskin, and he will get himself killed. We were in the cloister. The wind was growing angrier all the time, the light dimmer, even if it was just past nuns. The day was approaching its sunset, and we had very little time left. It is late, William said, and when a man has little time, he must take care to maintain his calm. We must act as if we had eternity before us. I have a problem to solve. How to penetrate the Finis Africae, because the final answer must be there. Then we must save some person, I have not yet determined which. Finally, we should expect something from the direction of the stables, which you will keep an eye on. Look at all the bustle. In fact, the space between the edificium and the cloister was unusually animated. A moment before, a novice, coming from the abbot's house, had run toward the edificium. Now Nicholas was coming out of it, heading for the dormitories. In one corner, that morning's group, Pacificus, Aimaro, and Peter, were deep in discussion with Alenardo, as if trying to convince him of something. Then they seemed to reach a decision. Aimaro supported the still reluctant Alenardo, and went with him toward the abbatial residence. They were just entering as Nicholas came out of the dormitory, leading Jorge in the same direction. Seeing the two Italians enter, he whispered something into Jorge's ear, and the old man shook his head. They continued, however, toward the chapter house. The abbot is taking the situation in hand. William murmured skeptically. From the edificium were emerging more monks, who belonged in the scriptorium, and they were immediately followed by Benno, who came toward us, more worried than ever. There's unrest in the scriptorium, he told us. Nobody is working, they are all talking among themselves. What is happening? What's happening is that the people who until this morning seemed the most suspect are all dead. Until yesterday everyone was on guard against Berengar, foolish and treacherous and lascivious, then the cellarer, a suspect heretic, and finally Malachi, so generally disliked. Now they don't know whom to be on guard against, and they urgently need to find an enemy, or a scapegoat. And each suspects the others, some are afraid, like you, others have decided to frighten someone else. You are all too agitated. Adza, take a look at the stables every now and then. I am going to get some rest. I should have been amazed. To go and rest when he had only a few hours left did not seem the wisest decision. But by now I knew my master. The more relaxed his body, the more ebullient his mind. Between Vespers and Compline, in which long hours of bewilderment are briefly narrated. It is difficult for me to narrate what happened in the hours that followed, between Vespers and Compline. William was absent. I roamed around the stables but noticed nothing abnormal. The grooms were bringing in the animals, made nervous by the wind, otherwise all was calm. I entered the church. Everyone was already in his place among the stalls, but the abbot noticed Jorge was absent. With a gesture he delayed the beginning of the office. He called for Benno, to dispatch him to look for the old man, but Benno was not there. Someone pointed out that he was probably making the scriptorium ready for its evening closing. The abbot, annoyed, said it had been decided that Benno would close nothing because he did not know the rules. Aimaro of Alessandria rose from his stall. If your paternity agrees, I will go and summon him. No one asked anything of you, the abbot said curtly, and Aimaro sat back down in his place, not without casting an inscrutable glance at Pacificus of Tivoli. The abbot called for Nicholas, who was not present. Someone reminded him that Nicholas was preparing supper, and the abbot made a gesture of annoyance, as if he were displeased to reveal to all that he was upset. "I want Jorge here," he cried. "Find him. You go," he ordered the master of novices. Another pointed out to him that Alenardo was also missing. "I know," the abbot said, "he is not well." I was near Peter of Sant'Albano and heard him say to his neighbor, Gunzo of Nola, in a vulgar dialect from central Italy which I partly understood, "I should think so." Today, when he came out after the colloquy, the poor old man was distraught. Abo behaves like the whore of Avignon. The novices were bewildered. With their innocent, boyish sensitivity they felt the tension reigning in choir, as I felt it. Long moments of silence and embarrassment ensued. The abbot ordered some psalms to be recited and he picked at random 3 that were not prescribed for Vespers by the rule. All looked at one another, then began praying in low voices. The novice master came back, followed by Benno, who took his seat, his head bowed. Jorge was not in the scriptorium or in his cell. The abbot commanded that the office begin. When it was over, before everyone headed for supper, I went to call William. He was stretched out on his pallet, dressed, motionless. He said he had not realized it was so late. I told him briefly what had happened. He shook his head. At the door of the refectory we saw Nicholas, who a few hours earlier had been accompanying Jorge. William asked him whether the old man had gone in immediately to see the abbot. Nicholas said Jorge had had to wait a long time outside the door, because Alenardo and Aimaro of Alessandria were in the hall. After Jorge was received, he remained inside for some time, while Nicholas waited for him. Then he came out and asked Nicholas to accompany him to the church, still deserted an hour before Vespers. The abbot saw us talking with the cellarer. "Brother William," he admonished, "are you still investigating?" He bade William sit at his table, as usual. For Benedictines hospitality is sacred. The supper was more silent than usual, and sad. The abbot ate listlessly, oppressed by grim thoughts. At the end he told the monks to hurry to Compline. Alenardo and Jorge were still absent. The monks pointed to the blind man's empty place and whispered. When the office was finished, the abbot asked all to say a special prayer for the health of Jorge of Burgos. It was not clear whether he meant physical health or eternal health. All understood that a new calamity was about to befall the community. Then the abbot ordered each monk to hurry, with greater alacrity than usual, to his own pallet. He commanded that no one, and he emphasized the words, no one, should remain in circulation outside the dormitory. The frightened novices were the first to leave, cowls over their faces, heads bowed, without exchanging the remarks, the nudges, the flashing smiles, the sly and concealed trippings with which they usually provoked one another, for novices, though young monks, are still boys, and the reproaches of their master are of little avail in preventing them all from behaving like boys, as their tender age demands. When the adults filed out, I fell into line, unobtrusively, behind the group that by now had been characterized to me as the Italians. Pacificus was murmuring to Aimaro, "Do you really believe Abo doesn't know where Jorge is?" And Aimaro answered, "He might know, and know that from where Jorge is he will never return. Perhaps the old man wanted too much, and Abo no longer wants him." As William and I pretended to retire to the Pilgrim's Hospice, we glimpsed the abbot re-entering the edificium through the still open door of the refectory. William advised waiting a while. Once the grounds were empty of every presence, he told me to follow him. We rapidly crossed the empty area and entered the church. After Compline, in which, almost by chance, William discovers the secret of entering the Finis Africae. Like a pair of assassins, we lurked near the entrance, behind a column, whence we could observe the chapel with the skulls. "Abo has gone to close the edificium," William said. "When he has barred the doors from the inside, he can only come out through the ossarium. And then we will see what he does." We did not discover what he did. An hour went by and he still had not reappeared. "He's gone into the Finis Africae," I said. "Perhaps," William answered. Eager to formulate more hypotheses, I added, "Perhaps he came out again through the refectory and has gone to look for Jorge." And William answered, "That is also possible. Perhaps Jorge is already dead," I imagined further. "Perhaps he is to the edificium and is killing the abbot. Perhaps they are both in some other place and some other person is lying in wait for them." What did the Italians want? And why was Benno so frightened? Was it perhaps only a mask he had assumed, to mislead us? Why had he lingered in the scriptorium during Vespers, if he didn't know how to close the scriptorium or how to get out? Did he want to essay the passages of the labyrinth? All is possible, William said. But only one thing is happening, or has happened, or is about to happen. And at last divine providence is endowing us with a radiant certitude. What is that? I asked, full of hope. That brother William of Baskerville, who now has the impression of having understood everything, does not know how to enter the Finis Africae. "To the stables, Adza, to the stables. And what if the abbot finds us? We will pretend to be a pair of ghosts." To me this did not seem a practical solution, but I kept silent. William was growing uneasy. We came out of the north door and crossed the cemetery, while the wind was whistling loudly, and I begged the Lord not to make us encounter two ghosts, for the abbey, on that night, did not lack for souls in torment. We reached the stables and heard the horses, more nervous than ever because of the fury of the elements. The main door of the building had, at the level of a man's chest, a broad metal grating, through which the interior could be seen. In the darkness we discerned the forms of the horses. I recognized Brunellus, the first on the left. To his right, the third animal in line raised his head, sensing our presence, and whinnied. I smiled. Tertius equi, I said. What? William asked. Nothing. I was remembering poor Salvatore. He wanted to perform God knows what magic with that horse, and with his Latin he called him Tertius equi, which would be the U. The U? Asked William, who had heard my prattle without paying much attention to it. Yes, because Tertius equi does not mean the third horse, but the third of the horse, and the third letter of the word, equus, is U. But this is all nonsense. William looked at me, and in the darkness I seemed to see his face transformed. God bless you, Adza, he said to me. Why, of course, suppositio materialis, the discourse is presumed de dicto and not de re. What a fool I am. He gave himself such a great blow on the forehead that I heard a clap, and I believe he hurt himself. My boy, this is the second time today that wisdom has spoken through your mouth, first in dream and now waking. Run to your cell and fetch the lamp, or, rather, both the lamps we hid. Let no one see you, and join me in church at once. Ask no questions. Go. I asked no questions and went. The lamps were under my bed, already filled with oil, and I had taken care to trim them in advance. I had the flint in my habit. With the two precious instruments clutched to my chest, I ran into the church. William was under the tripod and was rereading the parchment with Venantius's notes. Adza, he said to me, primum et septimum de quatuor, does not mean the first and seventh of four, but of the four, the word, four. For a moment I still did not understand, but then I was enlightened. Super thronos vigenti quatuor. The writing, the verse, the words are carved over the mirror. Come, William said, perhaps we are still in time to save a life. Whose? I asked, as he was manipulating the skulls and opening the passage to the ossarium. The life of someone who does not deserve it, he said. We were already in the underground passage, our lamps alight, moving toward the door that led to the kitchen. I said before that at this point you pushed a wooden door and found yourself in the kitchen, behind the fireplace, at the foot of the circular staircase that led to the scriptorium. And just as we were pushing that door, we heard to our left some muffled sounds within the wall. They came from the wall beside the door, where the row of niches with skulls and bones ended. Instead of a last niche, there was a stretch of blank wall of large squared blocks of stone, with an old plaque in the center that had some worn monograms carved on it. The sounds came, it seemed, from behind the plaque, or else from above the plaque, partly beyond the wall, and partly almost over our heads. If something of the sort had happened the first night, I would immediately have thought of dead monks. But by now I tended to expect worse from living monks. Who can that be? I asked. William opened the door and emerged behind the fireplace. The blows were heard also along the wall that flanked the stairs, as if someone were prisoner inside the wall, or else in that thickness, truly vast, that presumably existed between the inner wall of the kitchen and the outer wall of the south tower. Someone is shut up inside there, William said. I have wondered all along whether there were not another access to the Finis Africae, in this edificium so full of passages. Obviously there is. From the ossarium, before you come up into the kitchen, a stretch of wall opens, and you climb up a staircase parallel to this, concealed in the wall, which leads right to the blind room. But who is in there? The second person. One is in the Finis Africae, another has tried to reach him, but the one above must have blocked the mechanism that controls the entrances. So the visitor is trapped. And he is making a great stir because, I imagine, there cannot be much air in that narrow space. Who is it? We must save him. We shall soon know who it is. And as for saving him, that can only be done by releasing the mechanism from above. We don't know the secret at this end. Let's hurry upstairs. So we went up to the scriptorium, and from there to the labyrinth, and we quickly reached the south tower. Twice I had to curb my haste, because the wind that came through the slits that night created currents that, penetrating those passages, blew moaning through the rooms, rustling the scattered pages on the desks, so that I had to shield the flame with my hand. Soon we were in the mirror room, this time prepared for the game of distortion awaiting us. We raised the lamps to illuminate the verse that surmounted the frame. Super thronos vigenti quatuor. At this point the secret was quite clear. The word, quatuor, has 7 letters, and we had to press on the Q and the R. I thought, in my excitement, to do it myself. I rapidly set the lamp down on the table in the center of the room. But I did this nervously, and the flame began to lick the binding of a book also set there. Watch out, idiot, William cried, and with a puff blew out the flame. You want to set fire to the library? I apologized and started to light the lamp again. It doesn't matter, William said, mine is enough. Take it and give me light, because the legend is too high and you couldn't reach it. We must hurry. And what if there is somebody armed in there? I asked, as William, almost groping, sought the fatal letters, standing on tiptoe, tall as he was, to touch the apocalyptic verse. Give me light, by the devil, and never fear. God is with us, he answered me, somewhat incoherently. His fingers were touching the Q of quatuor, and, standing a few paces back, I saw better than what he was doing. I have already said that the letters of the verses seem carved or incised in the wall. Apparently those of the word quatuor were metal outlines, behind which a wondrous mechanism had been placed and walled up. When it was pushed forward, the Q made a kind of sharp click, and the same thing happened when William pressed on the R. The whole frame of the mirror seemed to shudder, and the glass surface snapped back. The mirror was a door, hinged on its left side. William slipped his hand into the opening now created between the right edge and the wall, and pulled toward himself. Creaking, the door opened out, in our direction. William slipped through the opening and I sculled behind him, the lamp high over my head. 2 hours after Compline, at the end of the 6th day, in the heart of the night that was giving birth to the 7th day, we entered the Finis Africae. 7th day. Night. In which, if it were to summarize the prodigious revelations of which it speaks, the title would have to be as long as the chapter itself, contrary to usage. We found ourselves on the threshold of a room similar in shape to the other 3 heptagonal blind rooms, dominated by a strong musty odor, as of mildewed books. The lamp, which I held up high, first illuminated the vault. Then, as I moved my arm downward, to right and left, the flame cast a vague light on the distant shelves along the walls. Finally, in the center, we saw a table covered with papers, and behind the table a seated figure, who seemed to be waiting for us in the darkness, immobile, if he was still alive. Even before the light revealed his face, William spoke. "Happy night, Venerable Jorge," he said. "Were you waiting for us?" The lamp now, once we had taken a few steps forward, illuminated the face of the old man, looking at us as if he could see. "Is that you, William of Baskerville?" he asked. "I have been waiting for you since this afternoon before vespers, when I came and closed myself in here. I knew you would arrive." "And the abbot?" William asked. "Is he the one making that noise in the secret stairway?" Jorge hesitated for a moment. "Is he still alive?" he asked. "I thought he would already have suffocated." "Before we start talking," William said, "I would like to save him." "You can open from this side." "No," Jorge said wearily, "not any longer. The mechanism is controlled from below, by pressing on the plaque, and up here a lever snaps, which opens a door back there, behind that case." He nodded over his shoulder. "Next to the case you could see a wheel with some counterweights, which controls the mechanism from up here. But when I heard the wheel turning, a sign that a BO had entered down below, I yanked at the rope that holds the weights, and the rope broke. Now the passage is closed on both sides, and you could never repair that device. The abbot is dead. Why did you kill him?" "Today, when he sent for me, he told me that thanks to you he had discovered everything. He did not yet know what I had been trying to protect. He has never precisely understood the treasures and the ends of the library. He asked me to explain what he did not know. He wanted the Finis Africae to be opened. The Italians had asked him to put an end to what they call the mystery kept alive by me and my predecessors. They are driven by the lust for new things. And you no doubt promised him you would come here and put an end to your life as you had put an end to the lives of the others, in such a way that the abbey's honor would be saved and no one would know anything. Then you told him the way to come, later, and check. But instead you waited for him, to kill him. Didn't you think he might enter through the mirror? No, ABO is too short, he would never have been able to reach the verse by himself. I told him about the other passage, which I alone still knew. It is the one I used for so many years, because it was simpler in the darkness. I had only to reach the chapel, then follow the bones of the dead to the end of the passage. So you had him come here, knowing you would kill him. I could no longer trust him. He was frightened. He had become famous because at Fossanova he managed to get a body down some circular stairs. Undeserved glory. Now he is dead because he was unable to climb his own stairway. You have been using it for 40 years. When you realized you were going blind and would no longer be able to control the library, you acted shrewdly. You had a man you could trust elected abbot, and as librarian you first had him named Robert of Bobbio, whom you could direct as you liked, and then Malachi, who needed your help and never took a step without consulting you. For 40 years you have been master of this abbey. This is what the Italian group realized, this is what Alenardo kept repeating, but no one would listen to him because they considered him mad by now. Am I right? But you were still awaiting me, and you couldn't block the mirror entrance, because the mechanism is set in the wall. Why were you waiting for me? How could you be sure I would arrive? William asked, but from his tone it was clear he had already guessed the answer and was expecting it as a reward for his own skill. From the first day I realized you would understand. From your voice, from the way you drew me to debate on a subject I did not want mentioned. You were better than the others, you would have arrived at the solution no matter what. You know that it suffices to think and to reconstruct in one's own mind the thoughts of the other. And then I heard you were asking the other monks questions, all of them the right ones. But you never asked questions about the library, as if you already knew its every secret. One night I came and knocked at your cell, and you were not in. You had to be here. 2 lamps had disappeared from the kitchen. I heard a servant say. And finally, when Severinus came to talk to you about a book the other day in the narthex, I was sure you were on my trail. But you managed to get the book away from me. You went to Malachi, who had no idea of the situation. In his jealousy, the fool was still obsessed with the idea that Adelmo had stolen his beloved Berengar, who by then craved younger flesh. Malachi didn't understand what Venantius had to do with this business, and you confused his thinking even further. You probably told him Berengar had been intimate with Severinus, and as a reward Severinus had given him a book from the Finis Africae. I don't know exactly what you told him. Crazed with jealousy, Malachi went to Severinus and killed him. Then he didn't have time to hunt for the book you had described to him, because the seller arrived. Is that what happened? More or less. But you didn't want Malachi to die. He had probably never looked at the books of the Finis Africae, for he trusted you, respected your prohibitions. He confined himself to arranging the herbs at evening to frighten any intruders. Severinus supplied him with them. This is why Severinus let Malachi enter the infirmary the other day. It was his regular visit to collect the fresh herbs he prepared daily, by the abbot's order. Have I guessed? You have guessed. I did not want Malachi to die. I told him to find the book again, by whatever means, and bring it back here without opening it. I told him it had the power of 1,000 scorpions. But for the first time the madman chose to act on his own initiative. I did not want him to die. He was a faithful agent. But do not repeat to me what you know. I know that you know. I do not want to feed your pride. You already see to that on your own. I heard you this morning in the scriptorium questioning Benno about the Coina Cipriani. You were very close to the truth. I do not know how you discovered the secret of the mirror, but when I learned from the abbot that you had mentioned the Finis Africae, I was sure you would come shortly. This is why I was waiting for you. So, now, what do you want? I want, William said, to see the last manuscript of the bound volume that contains an Arabic text, a Syriac one, and an interpretation or transcription of the Coina Cipriani. I want to see that copy in Greek, made perhaps by an Arab or by a Spaniard, that you found when, as assistant to Paul of Rimini, you arranged to be sent back to your country to collect the finest manuscripts of the Apocalypse in Leon and Castile. A booty that made you famous and respected here in the Abbey and caused you to win the post of librarian, which rightfully belonged to Alenardo, 10 years your senior. I want to see that Greek copy written on linen paper, which was then very rare and was manufactured in silos, near Burgos, your home. I want to see the book you stole there after reading it, to keep others from reading it, and you hid it here, protecting it cleverly, and you did not destroy it because a man like you does not destroy a book, but simply guards it and makes sure no one touches it. I want to see the second book of the Poetics of Aristotle, the book everyone has believed lost or never written, and of which you hold perhaps the only copy. What a magnificent librarian you would have been, William, Jorge said, with a tone at once admiring and regretful. So you know everything. Come, I believe there is a stool on your side of the table. Sit, here is your prize. William sat and put down the lamp, which I had handed him, illuminating Jorge's face from below. The old man took a volume that lay before him and passed it to William. I recognized the binding. It was the book I had opened in the infirmary, thinking it an Arabic manuscript. Read it, then, leaf through it, William, Jorge said. You have won. William looked at the volume but did not touch it. From his habit he took a pair of gloves, not his usual mitts with the fingertips exposed, but the ones Severinus was wearing when we found him dead. Slowly he opened the worn and fragile binding. I came closer and bent over his shoulder. Jorge, with his sensitive hearing, caught the noise I made. Are you here, too, boy? He said. I will show it to you, too, afterward. William rapidly glanced over the first pages. It is an Arabic manuscript on the sayings of some fool, according to the catalogue, he said. What is it? Oh, silly legends of the infidels, which hold that fools utter clever remarks that amaze even their priests and delight their caliphs. The second is a Syriac manuscript, but according to the catalogue it is the translation of a little Egyptian book on alchemy. How does it happen to be in this collection? It is an Egyptian work from the 3rd century of our era. Coherent with the work that follows, but less dangerous. No one would lend an ear to the ravings of an African alchemist. He attributes the creation of the world to divine laughter. He raised his face and recited, with the prodigious memory of a reader who for 40 years now had been repeating to himself things read when he still had the gift of sight. The moment God laughed 7 gods were born who governed the world. The moment he burst out laughing light appeared. At his second laugh appeared water, and on the 7th day of his laughing appeared the soul. Folly. Likewise the work that comes after, by one of the countless idiots who set themselves to glossing the Coina. But these are not what interest you. William, in fact, had rapidly passed over the pages and had come to the Greek text. I saw immediately that the pages were of a different, softer material, the first almost worn away, with a part of the margin consumed, spattered with pale stains, such as time and dampness usually produce on other books. William read the opening lines, first in Greek, then translating into Latin, and then he continued in this language so that I, too, could learn how the fatal book began. In the first book we dealt with tragedy and saw how, by arousing pity and fear, it produces catharsis, the purification of those feelings. As we promised, we will now deal with comedy, as well as with satire and mime, and see how, in inspiring the pleasure of the ridiculous, it arrives at the purification of that passion. That such passion is most worthy of consideration we have already said in the book on the soul, inasmuch as, alone among the animals, man is capable of laughter. We will then define the type of actions of which comedy is the mimesis, then we will examine the means by which comedy excites laughter, and these means are actions and speech. We will show how the ridiculousness of actions is born from the likening of the best to the worst and vice versa, from arousing surprise through deceit, from the impossible, from violation of the laws of nature, from the irrelevant and the inconsequent, from the debasing of the characters, from the use of comical and vulgar pantomime, from disharmony, from the choice of the least worthy things. We will then show how the ridiculousness of speech is born from the misunderstandings of similar words for different things and different words for similar things, from garrulity and repetition, from play on words, from diminutives, from errors of pronunciation, and from barbarisms. William translated with some difficulty, seeking the right words, pausing now and then. As he translated he smiled, as if he recognized things he was expecting to find. He read the first page aloud, then stopped, as if he were not interested in knowing more, and rapidly leafed through the following pages. But after a few pages he encountered resistance, because near the upper corner of the side edge, and along the top, some pages had stuck together, as happens when the damp and deteriorating papery substance forms a kind of sticky paste. Jorge realized that the rustle of pages had ceased, and he urged William on. "Go on, read it, leaf through it. It is yours, you have earned it." William laughed, seeming rather amused. "Then it is not true that you consider me so clever, Jorge. You cannot see. I have gloves on. With my fingers made clumsy like this, I cannot detach one page from the next. I should proceed with bare hands, moistening my fingers with my tongue, as I happened to do this morning while reading in the scriptorium, so that suddenly the mystery also became clear to me. And I should go on leafing like that until a good portion of the poison had passed to my mouth. I am speaking of the poison that you, one day long ago, took from the laboratory of Severinus. Perhaps you were already worried then, because you had heard someone in the scriptorium display curiosity, either about the Finis Africae or about the lost book of Aristotle, or about both. I believe you kept the ampule for a long time, planning to use it the moment you sensed danger. And you sensed that days ago, when Venantius came too close to the subject of this book, and at the same time Berengar, heedless, vain, trying to impress Adelmo, showed he was less secretive than you had hoped. So you came and set your trap. Just in time, because a few nights later Venantius got in, stole the book, and avidly leafed through it, with an almost physical voracity. He soon felt ill and ran to seek help in the kitchen. Where he died. Am I mistaken? No, go on. The rest is simple. Berengar finds Venantius's body in the kitchen, fears there will be an inquiry, because, after all, Venantius got into the edificium at night thanks to Berengar's prior revelation to Adelmo. He doesn't know what to do. He loads the body on his shoulders and flings it into the jar of blood, thinking everyone will be convinced Venantius drowned. And how do you know that was what happened? You know it as well. I saw how you reacted when they found a cloth stained with Berengar's blood. With that cloth the foolhardy man had wiped his hands after putting Venantius in the jar. But since Berengar had disappeared, he could only have disappeared with the book, which by this point had aroused his curiosity, too. And you were expecting him to be found somewhere, not bloodstained but poisoned. The rest is clear. Severinus finds the book, because Berengar went first to the infirmary to read it, safe from indiscreet eyes. Malachi, at your instigation, kills Severinus, then dies himself when he comes back here to discover what was so forbidden about the object that had made him a murderer. And thus we have an explanation for all the corpses. What a fool. Who? Because of a remark of Alenardo's, I was convinced the series of crimes followed the sequence of the 7 trumpets of the apocalypse. Hail for Adelmo, and his death was a suicide. Blood for Venantius, and there it had been a bizarre notion of Berengar's. Water for Berengar himself, and it had been a random act. The third part of the sky for Severinus, and Malachi had struck him with the armillary sphere because it was the only thing he found handy. And finally scorpions for Malachi. Why did you tell him that the book had the power of 1,000 scorpions? Because of you. Alenardo had told me about his idea, and then I heard from someone that you, too, found it persuasive. I became convinced that a divine plan was directing these deaths, for which I was not responsible. And I told Malachi that if he were to become curious he would perish in accordance with the same divine plan, and so he did. So, then, I conceived a false pattern to interpret the moves of the guilty man, and the guilty man fell in with it. And it was this same false pattern that put me on your trail. Everyone nowadays is obsessed with the Book of John, but you seem to me the one who pondered it most, and not so much because of your speculations about the Antichrist as because you came from the country that has produced the most splendid apocalypses. One day somebody told me it was you who had brought the most beautiful codices of this book to the library. Then, another day, Alenardo was raving about a mysterious enemy who had been sent to seek books in silos. My curiosity was piqued when he said this enemy had returned prematurely into the realm of darkness. At first it might have seemed the man he was speaking of had died young, but he was referring to your blindness. Silos is near Burgos, and this morning, in the catalogue, I found a series of acquisitions, all of them Spanish apocalypses, from the period when you had succeeded or were about to succeed Paul of Rimini. And in that group of acquisitions there was this book also. But I couldn't be positive of my reconstruction until I learned that the stolen book was on linen paper. Then I remembered Silos, and I was sure. Naturally, as the idea of this book and its venomous power gradually began to take shape, the idea of an apocalyptic pattern began to collapse, though I couldn't understand how both the book and the sequence of the trumpets pointed to you. But I understood the story of the book better because, directed by the apocalyptic pattern, I was forced more and more to think of you and your debates about laughter. So that this evening, when I no longer believed in the apocalyptic pattern, I insisted on watching the stables, and in the stables, by pure chance, Adza gave me the key to entering the Finis Africae. I cannot follow you, Jorge said. You are proud to show me how, following the dictates of your reason, you arrived at me, and yet you have shown me you arrived here by following a false reasoning. What do you mean to say to me? To you, nothing. I am disconcerted, that is all. But it is of no matter. I am here. The Lord was sounding the 7 trumpets. And you, even in your error, heard a confused echo of that sound. You said this yesterday evening in your sermon. You were trying to convince yourself that this whole story proceeded according to a divine plan, in order to conceal from yourself the fact that you were a murderer. I have killed no one. Each died according to his destiny because of his sins. I was only an instrument. Yesterday you said that Judas also was an instrument. That does not prevent him from being damned. I accept the risk of damnation. The Lord will absolve me, because he knows I acted for his glory. My duty was to protect the library. A few minutes ago you were ready to kill me, too, and also this boy. You were subtler, but no better than the others. And now what will happen, now that I have eluded the trap? We shall see, Jorge answered. I do not necessarily want your death, perhaps I will succeed in convincing you. But first tell me, how did you guess it was the second book of Aristotle? Your anathemas against laughter would surely not have been enough for me, or what little I learned about your argument with the others. At first I didn't understand their significance. But there were references to a shameless stone that rolls over the plain, and to cicadas that will sing from the ground, to venerable fig trees. I had already read something of the sort. I verified it during these past few days. These are examples that Aristotle used in the first book of the Poetics and in the Rhetoric. Then I remembered that Isidore of Seville defines comedy as something that tells of stupor virginum et amores meretricum. How shall I put it? Of less than virtuous loves. Gradually this second book took shape in my mind as it had to be. I could tell you almost all of it, without reading the pages that were meant to poison me. Comedy is born from the comai, that is, from the peasant villages, as a joyous celebration after a meal or a feast. Comedy does not tell of famous and powerful men, but of base and ridiculous creatures, though not wicked, and it does not end with the death of the protagonists. It achieves the effect of the ridiculous by showing the defects and vices of ordinary men. Here Aristotle sees the tendency to laughter as a force for good, which can also have an instructive value. Through witty riddles and unexpected metaphors, though it tells us things differently from the way they are, as if it were lying, it actually obliges us to examine them more closely, and it makes us say, "Ah, this is just how things are, and I didn't know it." Truth reached by depicting men and the world as worse than they are or than we believe them to be, worse in any case than the epics, the tragedies, lives of the saints have shown them to us. Is that it? Fairly close. You reconstructed it by reading other books? Many of which Venantius was working on. I believe Venantius had been hunting for this book for some time. He must have read in the catalog the indications I also read, and must have been convinced this was the book he was seeking. But he didn't know how to enter the Finis Africae. When he heard Berengar speak of it with Adelmo, then he was of like a dog on the track of a hare. That is what happened. I understood at once. I realized the moment had come when I would have to defend the library tooth and nail. And you spread the ointment. It must have been a hard task, in the dark. By now my hands see more than your eyes. I had taken a brush from Severinus, and I also used gloves. It was a good idea, was it not? It took you a long time to arrive at it. Yes. I was thinking of a more complex device, a poisoned pin or something of the sort. I must say that your solution was exemplary. The victim poisoned himself when he was alone, and only to the extent that he wanted to read. I realized, with a shudder, that at this moment these two men, arrayed in a mortal conflict, were admiring each other, as if each had acted only to win the other's applause. The thought crossed my mind that he artifices Berengar used to seduce Adelmo, and the simple and natural acts with which the IRL had aroused my passion and my desire, were nothing compared with the cleverness and mad skill each used to conquer the other, nothing compared with the act of seduction going on before my eyes at that moment, which had unfolded over 7 days, each of the two interlocutors making, as it were, mysterious appointments with the other, each secretly aspiring to the other's approbation, each fearing and hating the other. But now tell me, William was saying, why did you want to shield this book more than so many others? Why did you hide, though not at the price of crime, treatises on necromancy, pages that may have blasphemed against the name of God, while for these pages you damned your brothers and have damned yourself? There are many other books that speak of coined why, many others that praise laughter. Why did this one fill you with such fear? Because it was by the philosopher. Every book by that man has destroyed a part of the learning that Christianity had accumulated over the centuries. The fathers had said everything that needed to be known about the power of the word, but then Boethius had only to gloss the philosopher and the divine mystery of the word was transformed into a human parody of categories and syllogism. The book of Genesis says what has to be known about the composition of the cosmos, but it sufficed to rediscover the physics of the philosopher to have the universe reconceived in terms of dull and slimy matter, and the Arab Averroes almost convinced everyone of the eternity of the world. We knew everything about the divine names, and the Dominican buried by ABO, seduced by the philosopher, renamed them, following the proud paths of natural reason. And so the cosmos, which for the Areopagite revealed itself to those who knew how to look up at the luminous cascade of the exemplary first cause, has become a preserve of terrestrial evidence for which they refer to an abstract agent. Before, we used to look to heaven, deigning only a frowning glance at the mire of matter. Now we look at the earth, and we believe in the heavens because of earthly testimony. Every word of the philosopher, by whom now even saints and prophets swear, has overturned the image of the Word. But he had not succeeded in overturning the image of God. If this book were to had become an object for open interpretation, we would have crossed the last boundary. But what frightened you in this discussion of laughter? You cannot eliminate laughter by eliminating the book. No, to be sure. But laughter is weakness, corruption, the foolishness of our flesh. It is the peasant's entertainment, the drunkard's license. Even the church in her wisdom has granted the moment of feast, carnival, fair, this diurnal pollution that releases humors and distracts from other desires and other ambitions. Still, laughter remains base, a defense for the simple, a mystery desecrated for the plebeians. The apostle also said as much, it is better to marry than to burn. Rather than rebel against God's established order, laugh and enjoy your foul parodies of order, at the end of the meal, after you have drained jugs and flasks. Elect the king of fools, lose yourselves in the liturgy of the ass and the pig, play at performing your Saturnalia head down. But here, now Jorge struck the table with his finger, near the book William was holding open. Here the function of laughter is reversed, it is elevated to art, the doors of the world of the learned are opened to it, it becomes the object of philosophy, and of perfidious theology. You saw yesterday how the simple can conceive and carry out the most lurid heresies, disavowing the laws of God and the laws of nature. But the church can deal with the heresy of the simple, who condemn themselves on their own, destroyed by their ignorance. The ignorant madness of Dolcino and his like will never cause a crisis in the divine order. He will preach violence and will die of violence, will leave no trace, will be consumed as carnival is consumed, and it does not matter whether during the feast the epiphany of the world upside down will be produced on earth for a brief time. Provided the act is not transformed into plan, provided this vulgar tongue does not find a Latin that translates it. Laughter frees the villain from fear of the devil, because in the feast of fools the devil also appears poor and foolish, and therefore controllable. But this book could teach that freeing oneself of the fear of the devil is wisdom. When he laughs, as the wine gurgles in his throat, the villain feels he is master, because he has overturned his position with respect to his lord. But this book could teach learned men the clever and, from that moment, illustrious artifices that could legitimatize the reversal. Then what in the villain is still, fortunately, an operation of the belly would be transformed into an operation of the brain. That laughter is proper to man is a sign of our limitation, sinners that we are. But from this book many corrupt minds like yours would draw the extreme syllogism, whereby laughter is man's end. Laughter, for a few moments, distracts the villain from fear. But law is imposed by fear, whose true name is fear of God. This book could strike the Luciferian spark that would set a new fire to the whole world, and laughter would be defined as the new art, unknown even to Prometheus, for cancelling fear to the villain who laughs. At that moment, dying does not matter. But then, when the license is passed, the liturgy again imposes on him, according to the divine plan, the fear of death. And from this book there could be born the new destructive aim to destroy death through redemption from fear. And what would we be, we sinful creatures, without fear, perhaps the most foresighted, the most loving of the divine gifts? For centuries the doctors and the fathers have secreted perfumed essences of holy learning to redeem, through the thought of that which is lofty, the wretchedness and temptation of that which is base. And this book, considering comedy a wondrous medicine, with its satire and mime, which would produce the purification of the passions through the enactment of defect, fault, weakness, would induce false scholars to try to redeem the lofty with a diabolical reversal, through the acceptance of the base. This book could prompt the idea that man can wish to have on earth, as your Bacon suggested with regard to natural magic, the abundance of the land of Cockaigne. But this is what we cannot and must not have. Look at the young monks who shamelessly read the paradising buffoonery of the Coinus Cypriani. What a diabolical transfiguration of the Holy Scripture. And yet as they read it they know it is evil. But on the day when the philosopher's word would justify the marginal jests of the debauched imagination, or when what has been marginal would leap to the center, every trace of the center would be lost. The people of God would be transformed into an assembly of monsters belched forth from the abysses of the terra incognita, and at that moment the edge of the known world would become the heart of the Christian empire, the Arimaspe on the throne of Peter, blemmies in the monasteries, dwarfs with huge bellies and immense heads in charge of the library. Servants laying down the law, but you, too, then, obeying, in the absence of any law. A Greek philosopher, whom your Aristotle quotes here, an accomplice and phyloctorides, said that the seriousness of opponents must be dispelled with laughter, and laughter opposed with seriousness. The prudence of our fathers made its choice. If laughter is the delight of the plebeians, the license of the plebeians must be restrained and humiliated, and intimidated by sternness. And the plebeians have no weapons for refining their laughter until they have made it an instrument against the seriousness of the spiritual shepherds who must lead them to eternal life and rescue them from the seductions of belly, pudenda, food, their sordid desires. But if one day somebody, brandishing the words of the philosopher and therefore speaking as a philosopher, were to raise the weapon of laughter to the condition of subtle weapon, if the rhetoric of conviction were replaced by the rhetoric of mockery, if the topics of the patient construction of the images of redemption were to be replaced by the topics of the impatient dismantling and upsetting of every holy and venerable image, oh, that day even you, William, and all your knowledge, would be swept away. Why, I would match my wit with the wit of others. It would be a better world than the one where the fire and red-hot iron of Bernard Guay humiliate the fire and red-hard iron of Dolcino. You yourself would by then be caught in the devil's plot. You would fight on the other side at the field of Armageddon, where the final conflict must take place. But by that day the Church must be able to impose once again its rule on the conflict. Blasphemy does not frighten us, because even in the cursing of God we recognize the deformed image of the wrath of Jehovah, who curses the rebellious angels. We are not afraid of the violence of those who kill the shepherds in the name of some fantasy of renewal, because it is the same violence as that of the princes who tried to destroy the people of Israel. We are not afraid of the severity of the Donatists, the mad suicide of the Circumcellions, the lust of the Bogomils, the proud purity of the Albigensians, the flagellant's need for blood, the evil madness of the brothers of the free spirit. We know them all and we know the root of their sins, which is also the root of our holiness. We are not afraid, and, above all, we know how to destroy them, better, how to allow them to destroy themselves, arrogantly carrying to its zenith the will to die that is born from their own nadir. Indeed, I would say their presence is precious to us, it is inscribed in the plan of God, because their sin prompts our virtue. Their cursing encourages our hymn of praise, their undisciplined penance regulates our taste for sacrifice, their impiety makes our piety shine, just as the Prince of Darkness was necessary, with his rebellion and his desperation, to make the glory of God shine more radiantly, the beginning and end of all hope. But if one day, and no longer as plebeian exception, but as Ascesis of the learned, devoted to the indestructible testimony of Scripture, the art of mockery were to be made acceptable, and to seem noble and liberal and no longer mechanical. If one day someone could say, and be heard, I laugh at the incarnation, then we would have no weapons to combat that blasphemy, because it would summon the dark powers of corporal matter, those that are affirmed in the fart and the belch, and the fart and the belch would claim the right that is only of the spirit, to breathe where they list. Lycurgus had a statue erected to laughter. You read that in the Libellus of Chloretian, who tried to absolve mimes of the sin of impiety, and tells how a sick man was healed by a doctor who helped him laugh. What need was there to heal him, if God had established that his earthly day had reached its end? I don't believe the doctor cured him. He taught him to laugh at his illness. Illness is not exorcised. It is destroyed, with the body of the sick man. If necessary. You are the devil, William said then. Jorge seemed not to understand. If he had been able to see, I would say he stared at his interlocutor with a dazed look. He said, yes, they lied to you. The devil is not the prince of matter. The devil is the arrogance of the spirit, faith without smile, truth that is never seized by doubt. The devil is grim because he knows where he is going, and, in moving, he always returns whence he came. You are the devil, and like the devil you live in darkness. If you wanted to convince me, you have failed. I hate you, Jorge, and if I could, I would lead you downstairs, across the ground, naked, with fowl's feathers stuck in your asshole and your face painted like a juggler and a buffoon, so the whole monastery would laugh at you and be afraid no longer. I would like to smear honey all over you and then roll you in feathers, and take you on a leash to fairs, to say to all. He was announcing the truth to you and telling you that the truth has the taste of death, and you believed, not in his words, but in his grimness. And now I say to you that, in the infinite whirl of possible things, God allows you also to imagine a world where the presumed interpreter of the truth is nothing but a clumsy raven, who repeats words learned long ago. You are worse than the devil, Minorite, Jorge said. You are a clown, like the saint who gave birth to you all. You are like your Francis, who de toto corpore faceret linguam, who preached sermons giving a performance like a mountebank's, who confounded the miser by putting full pieces in his hand, who humiliated the nun's devotion by reciting the miserere instead of the sermon, who begged in French, and imitated with a piece of wood the movements of a violin player, who disguised himself as a tramp to confound the gluttonous monks, who flung himself naked in the snow, spoke with animals and plants, transformed the very mystery of the Nativity into a village spectacle, called the Lamb of Bethlehem by imitating the bleat of a sheep. It was a good school. Was that Friar Dio de Salvi of Florence not a Minorite? Yes. William smiled. The one who went to the convent of the preachers and said he would not accept food if first they did not give him a piece of Brother John's tunic to preserve as a relic. And when he was given it he wiped his behind and threw it in the dung heap and with a stick rolled it around in the dung, shouting, Alas, help me, brothers, because I dropped the saint's relic in the latrine. This story amuses you, apparently. Perhaps you would like to tell me also the one about that other Minorite friar Paul Millimosh, who one day fell full length on the ice. When his fellow citizens mocked him and one asked him whether he would not like to lie on something better, he said to the man, Yes, your wife. That is how you and your brothers seek the truth. That is how Francis taught people to look at things from another direction. But we have disciplined them. You saw them yesterday, your brothers. They have rejoined our ranks, they no longer speak like the simple. The simple must not speak. This book would have justified the idea that the tongue of the simple is the vehicle of wisdom. This had to be prevented, which I have done. You say I am the devil, but it is not true. I have been the hand of God. The hand of God creates, it does not conceal. There are boundaries beyond which it is not permitted to go. God decreed that certain papers should bear the words, Hic sunt leones. God created the monsters, too. And you. And he wants everything to be spoken of. Jorge reached out his shaking hands and drew the book to him. He held it open but turned it around, so that William could still see it in the right position. Then why, he said, did he allow this text to be lost over the course of the centuries, and only one copy to be saved, and the copy of that copy, which had ended up God knows where, to remain buried for years in the hands of an infidel who knew no Greek, and then to lie abandoned in the secrecy of an old library, where I, not you, was called by Providence to find it and to hide it for more years still? I know, as if I saw it written in adamantine letters with my eyes, which see things you do not see. I know that this was the will of the Lord, and I acted, interpreting it. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Night. In which the ekpyrosis takes place, and because of excess virtue the forces of hell prevail. The old man was silent. He held both hands open on the book, as if caressing its pages, flattening them the better to read them, or as if he wanted to protect the book from a raptor's talons. All of this, in any case, has been to no avail, William said to him. Now it is over. I have found you, I have found the book, and the others died in vain. Not in vain, Jorge said. Perhaps there were too many of them. And if you needed proof that this book is accursed, you have had it. And to ensure they have not died in vain, one more death will not be too many. He spoke, and with his fleshless, diaphanous hands he began slowly tearing to strips and shreds the limp pages of the manuscript, stuffing them into his mouth, slowly swallowing as if he were consuming the host and he wanted to make it flesh of his flesh. William looked at him, fascinated, and seemed not to grasp what was happening. Then he recovered himself and leaned forward, shouting, "What are you doing?" Jorge smiled, baring his bloodless gums, as a yellowish slime trickled from his pale lips over the sparse white hairs on his chin. You were awaiting the sound of the seventh trumpet, were you not? Now listen to what the voice says. Seal what the seven thunders have said and do not write it. Take and devour it. It will make bitter your belly, but to your lips it will be sweet as honey. You see? Now I seal that which was not to be said. In the grave I become. He laughed, Jorge. For the first time I heard him laugh. He laughed with his throat, though his lips did not assume the shape of gaiety, and he seemed almost to be weeping. You did not expect it, William, not this conclusion, did you? This old man, by the grace of God, wins once more, does he not? And as William tried to take the book away from him, Jorge, who sensed the movement, feeling the vibration of the air, drew back, clasping the volume to his chest with his left hand while his right went on tearing the pages and cramming them into his mouth. He was on the other side of the table, and William, who could not reach him, tried abruptly to move around the obstacle. But he knocked over his stool, catching his habit in it, so that Jorge was able to perceive the disturbance. The old man laughed again, louder this time, and with unexpected rapidity thrust out his right hand, groping for the lamp. Guided by the heat, he reached the flame and pressed his hand over it, unafraid of pain, and the light went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for the last time we heard the laughter of Jorge, who said, "Find me now. Now I am the one who sees best." Then he was silent and did not make another sound, moving with those silent footsteps that always made his appearances so unexpected, and we heard only, from time to time, in different parts of the room, the sound of the tearing paper. Adza! William cried. Stay by the door. Don't let him go out. But he had spoken too late, because I, who for some moments had been yearning to fling myself on the old man, had jumped forward when the darkness fell, trying to circle the table on the side opposite the one around which my master had moved. Too late I realized I had enabled Jorge to gain the door, because the old man could move in the dark with extraordinary confidence. We heard a sound of tearing paper behind us, somewhat muffled, because it came from the next room. And at the same time we heard another sound, a harsh, progressive creaking, the groan of hinges. The mirror! William cried. He is shutting us inside. Led by the sound, we both rushed toward the entrance. I stumbled over a stool and bruised my leg but paid no heed, because in a flash I realized that if Jorge shut us in we would never get out. In the darkness we would never find the way to open the door, not knowing what had to be maneuvered on this side, or how. I believe William moved with the same desperation as I did, because I felt him beside me as both of us, reaching the threshold, pressed ourselves against the back of the mirror, which was closing toward us. We arrived in time. The door stopped, then gave way and reopened. Obviously Jorge, sensing the conflict was unequal, had left. We came out of the accursed room, but now we had no idea where the old man was heading, and the darkness was still complete. All of a sudden I remembered, Master. I have the flint with me. What are you waiting for, then? William cried. Find the lamp and light it. I rushed back in the darkness, into the finis Africae, groping for the lamp. I found it at once, by divine miracle, then dug inside my scapular and pulled out the flint. My hands were trembling, and 2 or 3 times I failed before I was able to light it, as William gasped at the door, Hurry, hurry. Finally I made a light. Hurry, William urged me again. Otherwise the old man will eat up all of Aristotle. And die. I cried in anguish, overtaking him and joining in the search. I don't care whether he dies, damn the monster. William cried, peering in every direction, moving at random. With what he has eaten, his fate is already sealed. But I want the book. Then he stopped and added, more calmly, wait. If we continue like this, we'll never find him. Hush. We'll remain still for a moment. We stiffened, in silence. And in the silence we heard, not far away, the sound of a body bumping into a case, and the racket of some falling books. That way, we shouted, together. We ran in the direction of the noise, but soon realized we would have to slow our pace. In fact, outside the Finis Africae, the library was filled that evening with gusts of air that hissed and moaned, in proportion to the strong wind outside. Heightened by our speed, they threatened to put out our light, so painfully recovered. Since we could not move faster, we would have to make Jorge move more slowly. But William had just the opposite idea and shouted, we've caught you, old man. Now we have light. And it was a wise decision, because the revelation probably upset Jorge, who moved faster, compromising his magic sensibility, his gift for seeing in the darkness. Soon we heard another noise, and, following it, when we entered room Y of Hispania, we saw him lying on the floor, the book still in his hands, as he attempted to pull himself to his feet among the books that had spilled from the table he had struck and overturned. He was trying to stand, but he went on tearing the pages, determined to devour his prey as quickly as possible. By the time we overtook him, he was on his feet. Sensing our presence, he confronted us, moving backward. His face, in the reddish glow of the lamp, now seemed horrible to us. The features were distorted, a malignant sweat streaked his brow and cheeks, his eyes, usually a deathly white, were bloodshot, from his mouth came scraps of parchment, and he looked like a ravening beast who had stuffed himself and could no longer swallow his food. Disfigured by anxiety, by the menace of the poison now flowing abundantly through his veins, by his desperate and diabolical determination, the venerable figure of the old man now seemed disgusting and grotesque. At other moments he might have inspired laughter, but we, too, were reduced to the condition of animals, dogs stalking their quarry. We could have taken him calmly, but we fell on him with violence. He writhed, clasped his hands on his chest to defend the volume. I grasped him with my left hand while with my right I tried to hold the lamp high, but I grazed his face with the flame. He sensed the heat, let out a muffled cry, almost a roar, as bits of paper spilled from his mouth, and his right hand let go of the volume, darted toward the lamp, and abruptly tore it from me, flinging it away. The lamp fell right on the pile of books that had been knocked from the table all in a heap, lying open. The oil spilled out, the fire immediately seized a fragile parchment, which blazed up like a bundle of dry twigs. Everything happened in a few moments, as if for centuries those ancient pages had been yearning for arson and were rejoicing in the sudden satisfaction of an immemorial thirst for ekpyrosis. William realized what was happening and let go of the old man, who, feeling himself free, stepped back a few paces. William hesitated an instant, most likely too long, uncertain whether to seize Jorge again or to hasten to put out the little pyre. One book, older than the others, burned almost immediately, sending up a tongue of flame. The fine gusts of the wind, which might have extinguished a weak flicker, encouraged the stronger, livelier flame, and even carried sparks flying from it. Put out that fire. Quickly. William cried. Everything will burn up. I rushed toward the blaze, then stopped, because I was unsure what to do. William again moved after me, to come to my aid. We held out our hands as our eyes sought something to smother the fire. I had a flash of inspiration. I slipped my habit over my head and tried to throw it on the heart of the fire. But the flames by now were too high. They consumed my garment and were nourished by it. Snatching back my scorched hands, I turned toward William and saw Jorge, who had approached again, directly behind him. The heat was now so strong that the old man could feel it very easily, so he knew with absolute certainty where the fire was. He flung the Aristotle into it. In an explosion of ire, William gave the old man a violent push. Jorge slammed into a case, banging his head against one corner. He fell to the ground. But William, whom I believe I heard utter a horrible curse, paid no heed to him. He turned to the books. Too late. The Aristotle, or what had remained of it after the old man's meal, was already burning. Meanwhile, some sparks had flown toward the walls, and already the volumes of another bookcase were crumpling in the fury of the fire. By now, not one but two fires were burning in the room. William, realizing we would not be able to put them out with our hands, decided to use books to save books. He seized a volume that seemed to him more stoutly bound than the others, more compact, and he tried to use it as a weapon to stifle the hostile element. But, slamming the studded binding on the pyre of glowing books, he merely stirred more sparks. Though he tried to scatter them with his feet, he achieved the opposite effect. Fluttering scraps of parchment, half-burned, rose and hovered like bats, while the air, allied with its airy fellow element, sent them to kindle the terrestrial matter of further pages. As misfortune would have it, this was one of the most untidy rooms of the labyrinth. Rolled-up manuscripts hung from the shelves, other books, falling apart, let pages slip from their covers, as from gaping mouths, tongues of vellum dried up by the ears. And the table must have held a great number of writings that Malachi, by then unassisted for some days, had neglected to put back in their places. So the room, after the spill Jorge caused, was invaded by parchments waiting only to be transformed into another element. In no time the place was a brazier, a burning bush. The bookcases themselves also joined in this sacrifice and were beginning to crackle. I realized the whole labyrinth was nothing but an immense sacrificial pyre, all prepared for the first spark. Water. We need water, William was saying, but then he added, but where can any water be found in this inferno? In the kitchen, down in the kitchen. I cried. William looked at me, puzzled, his face flushed by that raging glow. Yes, but by the time we've gone down and come back up. The devil take it, he then cried. This room is lost, in any case, and perhaps the next one as well. Let's go down at once. I'll find water, and you rush out to give the alarm. We need a lot of people. We found the way toward the stairs. The conflagration lighted the subsequent rooms as well, but more and more faintly, so we crossed the last two almost groping again. Below, the moon dimly illuminated the scriptorium, and from there we went down to the refectory. William rushed into the kitchen, I to the refectory door, fumbling to open it from the inside. I succeeded after a fair amount of labor, for my agitation made me clumsy and inept. I stepped out onto the grass, ran toward the dormitory, then realized I could not wake the monks one by one. I had an inspiration. I went into the church, hunting for the access to the bell tower. When I found it, I grabbed all the ropes, ringing the alarm. I pulled hard, and the central bell rope, as it rose, drew me up with it. In the library the backs of my hands had been burned. My palms were still unhurt, but now I burned them, too, letting them slip along the ropes until they bled and I had to let go. By then, however, I had made enough noise. I rushed outside in time to see the first monks coming from the dormitory, as I heard in the distance the voices of the servants, who were appearing at the doors of their lodgings. I could not explain myself clearly, because I was unable to formulate words, and the first that came to my lips were in my mother tongue. With bleeding hand I pointed to the windows of the south wing of the edificium, at whose alabaster panes there was an abnormal glow. I realized, from the intensity of the light, that the fire had spread to other rooms while I had come down and rung the bells. All the windows of Africa and the whole facade between it and the east tower now flickered with irregular flashes. Water! Fetch water! I shouted. At first no one understood. The monks were so used to considering the library a sacred and inaccessible place that they could not understand it was threatened by the sort of banal accident that might have befallen a peasant hut. The first who looked up at the windows blessed themselves, murmuring words of fear, and I realized they were thinking of further apparitions. I grabbed their clothing and begged them to understand, until someone finally translated my sobs into human words. It was Nicholas of Morimondo, who said, "The library is on fire." "It is, indeed," I whispered, sinking to the ground, exhausted. Nicholas displayed great energy, shouted orders to the servants, gave advice to the monks surrounding him, sent some to open the other doors of the edificium, others to seek water in vessels of every kind. He directed those present toward the wells and the water tanks of the abbey. He ordered the cowherds to use the mules and asses to transport jars. If a man invested with authority had given these orders, he would have been obeyed at once. But the servants were accustomed to taking orders from Remigio, the scribes from Malachi, all of them from the abbot. And, alas, none of those three was present. The monks looked around for the abbot, to ask instructions and solace, and did not find him, only I knew that he was dead, or dying, at that moment, shut up in an airless passage that was now turning into an oven, a bowl of Phalaris. Nicholas shoved the cowherds in one direction, but some other monks, with the best of intentions, pushed them in another. Some of the brothers had obviously lost their heads, others were still dazed with sleep. I tried to explain, now that I had recovered the power of speech, but it must be remembered that I was almost naked, having thrown my habit on the flames, and the sight of a boy, as I was then, bleeding, his face smudged by soot, his body indecently hairless, numbed now by the cold, surely did not inspire much confidence. Finally Nicholas managed to drag a few brothers and some other men into the kitchen, which in the meantime someone had opened. Another monk had the good sense to bring some torches. We found the place in great disorder, and I realized William must have turned it upside down, seeking water in vessels to carry it. At that point I saw William himself appear from the door of the refectory, his face singed, his habit smoking. He was carrying a large pot in his hand, and I felt pity for him, pathetic allegory of helplessness. I realized that even if he had succeeded in carrying a pan of water to the second floor without spilling it, and even if he had done so more than once, he could have achieved very little. I recalled the story of St. Augustine, when he saw a boy trying to scoop up the water of the sea with a spoon. The boy was an angel and did this to make fun of a saint who wanted to understand the mysteries of the divine nature. And, like the angel, William spoke to me, leaning in exhaustion against the doorjamb. "It is impossible, we will never do it, not even with all the monks of the abbey. The library is lost." Unlike the angel, William wept. I hugged him, as he tore a cloth from a table and tried to cover me. We stopped and, finally defeated, observed what was going on around us. There was a confused bustle, people going up the spiral staircase barehanded and encountering others, barehanded, who had been driven upstairs by their curiosity and were now coming down to look for vessels. Others, cleverer, had immediately started hunting for pans and basins, only to realize there was not sufficient water in the kitchen. Suddenly the great room was invaded by mules, bearing huge jars, and the cowherds driving the animals unloaded them and started to carry up the water. But they did not know how to climb to the scriptorium, and it was a while before some of the scribes told them, and when they went up they bumped into other rushing down, terrified. Jars broke and the water spread over the ground, though other jars were passed up the stairs by willing hands. I followed the group and found myself in the scriptorium. Thick smoke came from the access to the library. The last men who had tried to go up to the east tower were already coming down, coughing, red-eyed, and they announced it was no longer possible to penetrate that hell. Then I saw Benno. His face distorted, he was coming up from the lower floor with an enormous vessel. He heard what those coming down were saying and he attacked them. Hell will swallow you all, cowards. He turned, as if seeking help, and saw me. Adza, he cried, the library, the library. He did not await my answer, but ran to the foot of the stairs and boldly plunged into the smoke. That was the last time I saw him. I heard a creaking sound from above. Bits of stone mixed with mortar were falling from the ceiling of the scriptorium. The keystone of a vault, carved in the shape of a flower, came loose and almost landed on my head. The floor of the labyrinth was giving way. I rushed downstairs and out into the open air. Some willing servants had brought ladders, with which they were trying to reach the windows of the upper floors, to take water up that way. But the highest ladders barely extended to the windows of the scriptorium, and those who had climbed up were unable to open them from the outside. They sent word down to have them opened from within, but at this point nobody dared try to go up there. Meanwhile, I was looking at the windows of the top floor. The whole library by now must have become a single smoking brazier as the fire raced from room to room, spreading rapidly among the thousands of dry pages. All the windows were alight, a black smoke came from the roof. The fire had already spread to the beams. The edificium, which had seemed so solid and tetragonous, revealed in these circumstances its weakness, its cracks, the walls corroded from within, the crumbling stones allowing the flames to reach the wooden elements wherever they were. Suddenly some windows shattered as if pressed by an inner force, the sparks flew out into the open air, dotting with fluttering glints the darkness of the night. The strong wind had become lighter, a misfortune, because, strong, it might have blown out the sparks, but light, it carried them, stimulating them, and with them made scraps of parchment swirl in the air, the delicate fragments of an inner torch. At that point an explosion was heard. The floor of the labyrinth had given way at some point and its blazing beams must have plunged to the floor below. Now I saw tongues of flame rise from the scriptorium, which was also tenanted by books and cases, and by loose papers, spread on the desks, ready to provoke the sparks. I heard cries of woe from a group of scribes who tore their hair and still thought of climbing up heroically, to recover their beloved parchments. In vain. The kitchen and refectory were now a crossroads of lost souls, rushing in all directions, each hindering the others. People bumped into one another, fell down. Those carrying vessels spilled their redemptive contents. The mules brought into the kitchen had sensed the presence of fire and, with a clatter of hoofs, dashed toward the exits, knocking down the human beings and even their own terrified grooms. It was obvious, in any case, that this horde of villains and of devout, wise, but unskilled men, with no one in command, was blocking even what aid might still have arrived. The whole abbey was in the grip of disorder, but this was only the beginning of the tragedy. Pouring from the windows and the roof, the triumphant cloud of sparks, fostered by the wind, was now descending on all sides, touching the roof of the church. Everyone knows how the most splendid cathedrals are vulnerable to the sting of fire. The house of God appears beautiful and well defended as the heavenly Jerusalem itself, thanks to the stone it proudly displays, but the walls and ceilings are supported by a fragile, if admirable, architecture of wood, and if the church of stone recalls the most venerable forests with its columns rising high, bold as oaks, to the vaults of the ceilings, these columns often have cores of oak and many of the trappings are also of wood. The altars, the choirs, the painted panels, the benches, the stalls, the candelabra. And so it was with the abbatial church, whose beautiful door had so fascinated me on the first day. The church caught fire in no time. The monks and the whole population of the place then understood that the very survival of the abbey was at stake, and all began rushing even more earnestly, and in even greater confusion, to deal with the new danger. To be sure, the church was more accessible, more easily defended than the library. The library had been doomed by its own impenetrability, by the mystery that protected it, by its few entrances. The church, maternally open to all in the hour of prayer, was open to all in the hour of succor. But there was no more water, or at least very little could be found stored, and the wells supplied it with natural parsimony and at a slow pace that did not correspond to the urgency of the need. All the monks would have liked to put out the fire of the church, but nobody knew how at this point. Moreover, the fire was spreading from above, and it was difficult to hoist men up to beat on the flames or smother them with dirt or rags. And when the flames arrived from below, it was futile by then to throw earth or sand on them, for the ceiling was crashing down on the firefighters, striking more than a few of them. And so the cries of regret for the many riches burned were now joined by the cries of pain at seared faces, crushed limbs, bodies buried under a sudden collapse of the high vaults. The wind had become furious again, and more furiously helped spread the fire. Immediately after the church, the barns and stables caught fire. The terrified animals broke their halters, kicked down the doors, scattered over the grounds, neighing, mooing, bleating, grunting horribly. Sparks caught the manes of many horses, and there were infernal creatures racing across the grass, flaming steeds that trampled everything in their path, without goal or respite. I saw old Alenardo wandering around, not understanding what was happening, knocked down by the magnificent Brunellus, haloed by fire. The old man was dragged in the dust, then abandoned there, a poor shapeless object. But I had neither means nor time to succor him, or to bemoan his end, because similar scenes were taking place everywhere. The horses in flames had carried the fire to places where the wind had not yet brought it. Now the forges were burning, and the novice's house. Hordes of people were running from one end of the compound to another, for no purpose or for illusory purposes. I saw Nicholas, his head wounded, his habit in shreds, now defeated, kneeling in the path from the gate, cursing the divine curse. I saw Pacificus of Tivoli, who, abandoning all notion of help, was trying to seize a crazed mule as it passed. When he succeeded, he shouted to me to do the same and to flee, to escape that horrid replica of Armageddon. I wondered where William was, fearing he had been trapped under some collapsing wall. I found him, after a long search, near the cloister. In his hand he had his traveling sack. When the fire was already spreading to the pilgrim's hospice, he had gone up to his cell to save at least his most precious belongings. He had collected my sack, too, and in it I found something to put on. We paused, breathless, to watch what was happening around us. By now the abbey was doomed. Almost all its buildings, some more, some less, had been reached by the fire. Those still intact would not remain so for long, because everything, from the natural elements to the confused work of the rescuers, was now contributing to the spread of the fire. Only the parts without buildings remained safe, the vegetable patch, the garden outside the cloister. Nothing more could be done to save the buildings. Abandoning the idea of saving them, we were able to observe everything without danger, standing in an open space. We looked at the church, now burning slowly, for it is characteristic of these great constructions to blaze up quickly in their wooden parts and then to agonize for hours, sometimes for days. The conflagration of the edificium was different. Here inflammable material was much more abundant, and the fire, having spread all through the scriptorium, had invaded the kitchen floor. As for the top floor, where once, and for hundreds of years, there had been the labyrinth, it was now virtually destroyed. It was the greatest library in Christendom, William said. Now, he added, the Antichrist is truly at hand, because no learning will hinder him any more. For that matter, we have seen his face tonight. Whose face? I asked, dazed. Jorge, I mean. In that face, deformed by hatred of philosophy, I saw for the first time the portrait of the Antichrist, who does not come from the tribe of Judas, as his heralds have it, or from a far country. The Antichrist can be born from piety itself, from excessive love of God or of the truth, as the heretic is born from the saint and the possessed from the seer. Fear prophets, Adza, and those prepared to die for the truth, for as a rule they make many others die with them, often before them, at times instead of them. Jorge did a diabolical thing because he loved his truth so lewdly that he dared anything in order to destroy falsehood. Jorge feared the second book of Aristotle because it perhaps really did teach how to distort the face of every truth, so that we would not become slaves of our ghosts. Perhaps the mission of those who love mankind is to make people laugh at the truth, to make truth laugh, because the only truth lies in learning to free ourselves from insane passion for the truth. But, Master, I ventured, sorrowfully, you speak like this now because you are wounded in the depths of your spirit. There is one truth, however, that you discovered tonight, the one you reached by interpreting the clues you read over the past few days. Jorge has won, but you have defeated Jorge because you exposed his plot. There was no plot, William said, and I discovered it by mistake. The assertion was self-contradictory, and I couldn't decide whether William really wanted it to be. But it was true that the tracks in the snow led to Brunellus, I said. It was true that Adelmo committed suicide. It was true that Venantius did not drown in the jar. It was true that the labyrinth was laid out the way you imagined it. It was true that one entered the Finis Africae by touching the word quatuor. It was true that the mysterious book was by Aristotle. I could go on listing all the true things you discovered with the help of your learning. I have never doubted the truth of signs, Adza. They're the only things man has with which to orient himself in the word. What I did not understand was the relation among signs. I arrived at Jorge through an apocalyptic pattern that seemed to underlie all the crimes, and yet it was accidental. I arrived at Jorge seeking one criminal for all the crimes, and we discovered that each crime was committed by a different person, or by no one. I arrived at Jorge pursuing the plan of a perverse and rational mind, and there was no plan, or, rather, Jorge himself was overcome by his own initial design, and there began a sequence of causes, and concauses, and of causes contradicting one another, which proceeded on their own, creating relations that did not stem from any plan. Where is all my wisdom, then? I behaved, stubbornly, pursuing a semblance of order, when I should have known well that there is no order in the universe. But in imagining an erroneous order you still found something. What you say is very fine, Adza, and I thank you. The order that our mind imagines is like a net, or like a ladder, built to attain something. But afterward you must throw the ladder away, because you discover that, even if it was useful, it was meaningless. Muaz Galici same die lighter abaverfen, so and I are gestigen. Is that how you say it? That is how it is said in my language. Who told you that? A mystic from your land. He wrote it somewhere, I forget where. And it is not necessary for somebody one day to find that manuscript again. The only truths that are useful are instruments to be thrown away. You have no reason to reproach yourself. You did your best. A human best, which is very little. It's hard to accept the idea that there cannot be an order in the universe because it would offend the free will of God and his omnipotence. So the freedom of God is our condemnation, or at least the condemnation of our pride. I dared, for the first and last time in my life, to express a theological conclusion. But how can a necessary being exist totally polluted with the possible? What difference is there, then, between God and primigenial chaos? Isn't affirming God's absolute omnipotence and his absolute freedom with regard to his own choices tantamount to demonstrating that God does not exist? William looked at me without betraying any feeling in his features, and he said, "How could a learned man go on communicating his learning if he answered yes to your question?" I did not understand the meaning of his words. "Do you mean," I asked, "that there would be no possible and communicable learning anymore if the very criterion of truth were lacking, or do you mean you could no longer communicate what you know because others would not allow you to?" At that moment a section of the dormitory roof collapsed with a huge din, blowing a cloud of sparks into the sky. Some of the sheep and the goats wandering through the grounds went past us, bleating horribly. A group of servants also went by us, shouting, nearly knocking us down. "There is too much confusion here," William said. Non in commotione dominus. Last page. The abbey burned for 3 days and 3 nights, and the last efforts were of no avail. As early as that morning of the 7th day of our sojourn in that place, when the survivors were fully aware that no building could be saved, when the finest constructions showed only their ruined outer walls, and the church, as if drawing into itself, swallowed its tower, even at that point everyone's will to combat the divine chastisement failed. The rush for the last few buckets of water grew more and more listless, while the chapter house and the superb apartments of the abbot were still burning. By the time the fire reached the far side of the various workshops, the servants had long since saved as many objects as they could, and had chosen to beat the countryside to recapture at least some of the livestock, which had fled beyond the walls in the confusion of the night. I saw some of the servants venture into what remained of the church. I presumed they were trying to get into the crypt to seize some precious object before running away. I do not know whether they succeeded, whether the crypt had not already collapsed, whether the louts did not sink into the bowels of the earth in their attempt to reach the treasure. Meanwhile, men were coming up from the village to lend a hand or to try to snatch some further booty. The dead for the most part remained among the ruins, which were still red hot. On the 3rd day, when the wounded had been treated and the corpses found outside had been buried, the monks and all the others collected their belongings and abandoned the still smoking abbey, as a place accursed. They scattered, I do not know where to. William and I left those parts on 2 horses we found astray in the wood. We considered them res nullius by now. We headed east. When we reached Bobbio again, we began to receive bad news of the emperor. On arriving in Rome, he had been crowned by the people. Considering any agreement with John now impossible, he had chosen an antipope. Nicholas V Marsilius had been named spiritual vicar of Rome, but through his fault, or his weakness, things very sad to report were taking place in that city. Priests loyal to the pope and unwilling to say mass were tortured, an Augustinian prior had been thrown into the lion's pit on the Capitoline. Marsilius and John of Jandun had declared John a heretic, and Louis had had him sentenced to death. But the emperor's misrule was antagonizing the local lords and depleting public funds. Gradually, as we heard this news, we delayed our descent to Rome, and I realized that William did not want to find himself witnessing events that would dash his hopes. When we came to Pomposa, we learned that Rome had rebelled against Louis, who had moved back up toward Pisa, while John's legates were triumphantly entering the papal city. Meanwhile, Michael of Cesena had realized that his presence in Avignon was producing no results. Indeed, he feared for his life, so he had fled, joining Louis in Pisa. Soon, foreseeing events and learning that the Bavarian would move on to Munich, we reversed our route and decided to proceed there, also because William sensed that Italy was becoming unsafe for him. In the ensuing months and years, Louis saw the alliance of his supporters, the Ghibelline lords, dissolve, and the following year the antipope Nicholas was to surrender to John, presenting himself with a rope around his neck. When we came to Munich, I had to take leave of my good master, amid many tears. His destiny was uncertain, and my family preferred for me to return to Melk. After that tragic night when William revealed to me his dismay before the ruins of the abbey, as if by tacit agreement we had not spoken again of that story. Nor did we mention it in the course of our sorrowful farewell. My master gave me much good advice about my future studies, and presented me with the glasses Nicholas had made for him, since he had his own back again. I was still young, he said to me, but one day they would come in handy, and, truly, I am wearing them on my nose now, as I write these lines. Then he embraced me with a father's tenderness and dismissed me. I never saw him again. I learned much later that he had died during the great plague that raged through Europe toward the middle of this century. I pray always that God received his soul and forgave him the many acts of pride that his intellectual vanity had made him commit. Years later, as a grown man, I had occasion to make a journey to Italy, sent by my abbot. I could not resist temptation, and on my return I went far out of my way to revisit what remained of the abbey. The 2 villages on the slopes of the mountain were deserted, the lands around them uncultivated. When I climbed up to the top, a spectacle of desolation and death appeared before my eyes, which moistened with tears. Of the great and magnificent constructions that once adorned that place, only scattered ruins remained, as had happened before with the monuments of the ancient pagans in the city of Rome. Ivy covered the shreds of wall-is, columns, the few architraves still intact. Weeds invaded the ground on all sides, and there was no telling where the vegetables and the flowers had once grown. Only the location of the cemetery was recognizable, because of some graves that still rose above the level of the terrain. Sole sign of life, some birds of prey hunted lizards and serpents that, like basilisks, slithered anion the stones or crawled over the walls. Of the church door only a few traces remained, eroded by mold. Half of the tympanum survived, and I still glimpsed there, dilated by the elements and dulled by lichens, the left eye of the enthroned Christ, and something of the lion's face. The edificium, except for the south wall, which was in ruins, seemed yet to stand and defy the course of time. The two outer towers, over the cliff, appeared almost untouched, but all the windows were empty sockets whose slimy tears were rotting vines. Inside, the work of art, destroyed, became confused with the work of nature, and across vast stretches of the kitchen the eye ran to the open heavens through the breach of the upper floors and the roof, fallen like fallen angels. Everything that was not green with moss was still black from the smoke of so many decades ago. Poking about in the rubble, I found at times scraps of parchment that had drifted down from the scriptorium and the library and had survived like treasures buried in the earth. I began to collect them, as if I were going to piece together the torn pages of a book. Then I noticed that in one of the towers there rose, tottering but still intact, a circular staircase to the scriptorium, and from there, by climbing a sloping bit of the ruin, I could reach the level of the library. Which, however, was only a sort of gallery next to the outside walls, looking down into the void at every point. Along one stretch of wall I found a bookcase, still miraculously erect, having come through the fire I cannot say how. It was rotted by water and consumed by termites. In it there were still a few pages. Other remnants I found by rummaging in the ruins below. Mine was a poor harvest, but I spent a whole day reaping it, as if from those dissected members of the library a message might reach me. Some fragments of parchment had faded, others permitted the glimpse of an image's shadow, or the ghost of one or more words. At times I found pages where whole sentences were legible, more often, intact bindings, protected by what had once been metal studs. Ghosts of books, apparently intact on the outside but consumed within, yet sometimes a half-page had been saved, and incipit was discernible, a title. I collected every relic I could find, filling 2 traveling sacks with them, abandoning things useful to me in order to save that miserable hoard. Along the return journey and afterward at Melk, I spent many, many hours trying to decipher those remains. Often from a word or a surviving image I could recognize what the work had been. When I found, in time, other copies of those books, I studied them with love, as if destiny had left me this bequest, as if having identified the destroyed copy were a clear sign from heaven that said to me, "Tal et lege." At the end of my patient reconstruction, I had before me a kind of lesser library, a symbol of the greater, vanished one. A library made up of fragments, quotations, unfinished sentences, amputated stumps of books. The more I reread this list the more I am convinced it is the result of chance and contains no message. But these incomplete pages have accompanied me through all the life that has been left me to live since then. I have often consulted them like an oracle, and I have almost had the impression that what I have written on these pages, which you will now read, unknown reader, is only a cento, a figured hymn, an immense acrostic that says and repeats nothing but what those fragments have suggested to me, nor do I know whether thus far I have been speaking of them or they have spoken through my mouth. But whichever of the two possibilities may be correct, the more I repeat to myself the story that has emerged from them, the less I manage to understand whether in it there is a design that goes beyond the natural sequence of the events and the times that connect them. And it is a hard thing for this old monk, on the threshold of death, not to know whether the letter he has written contains some hidden meaning, or more than one, or many, or none at all. But this inability of mine to see is perhaps the effect of the shadow that the great darkness, as it approaches, is casting on the aged world. Est ubi gloria nunc Babyloniae? Where are the snows of yesteryear? The earth is dancing the dance of macabre. At times it seems to me that the Danube is crowded with ships loaded with fools going toward a dark place. All I can do now is be silent. O quam salubre, quam iacundum et suave est sedere in solitudine et tacere et loci cum Deo. Soon I shall be joined with my beginning, and I no longer believe that it is the God of glory of whom the abbots of my order spoke to me, or of boy, as the Minorites believed in those days, perhaps not even of piety. Gott ist ein lauter nichts, ihn rohrt kein nun noch higher. I shall soon enter this broad desert, perfectly level and boundless, where the truly pious heart succumbs in bliss. I shall sink into the divine shadow, in a dumb silence and an ineffable union, and in this sinking all equality and all inequality shall be lost, and in that abyss my spirit will lose itself, and will not know the equal or the unequal, or anything else, and all differences will be forgotten. I shall be in the simple foundation, in the silent desert where diversity is never seen, in the privacy where no one finds himself in his proper place. I shall fall into the silent and uninhabited divinity where there is no work and no image. It is cold in the scriptorium, my thumb aches. I leave this manuscript, I do not know for whom, I no longer know what it is about. Stat Rosa Pristina nomina nuda tenemus. The end. Notes. 1 Liber aggregationis seu Liber secretorum Alberti Magni, Londinium, juxta pondum qui vulgariter dissiter fleet brig, MCCCCLXXXV. 2 les admirables secrets d'Albert le Grand, à Lyon, chez les héritiers Baringos, Freighters, à l'enseigne de Grippe, MDCCLXXV. Secrets merveilleux de la magie naturelle et cabalistique du petit Albert, à Lyon, chez les héritiers Baringos, Freighters, à l'enseigne de Grippe, MDCCXXIX.